The year 476 AD marked not merely the end of an emperor's reign, but the dissolution of a governmental structure that had dominated the Italian peninsula for over 5 centuries. When the Germanic chieftain Odoacer entered the imperial palace at Ravenna and confronted the teenage Romulus Augustulus, the encounter represented far more than a simple change of leadership. The Western Roman Empire's administrative apparatus, already hollowed out by decades of military pressures and fiscal collapse, finally surrendered its claim to political supremacy over Italy. Romulus Augustulus, mockingly dubbed the Little Emperor by his contemporaries, had ruled for less than a year when Odoacer's forces reached Ravenna. The boy emperor's father, Orestes, had installed his son as a puppet ruler while maintaining actual control as Magister Militum. However, Orestes had fatally miscalculated when he refused to grant federate status and land grants to Germanic troops under Odoacer's command. These soldiers, primarily Heruli, Rugi and Siri, had served Rome faithfully, but demanded the same territorial concessions that other Germanic groups had received. Orestes' refusal triggered a swift military response that culminated in his death at Pavia and his son's deposition. The deposition itself unfolded with remarkable restraint. Rather than executing the young emperor, Odoacer granted him a pension of 6,000 gold solidi annually, and permitted him to retire to a villa in Campania. More significantly, Odoacer chose not to proclaim himself emperor or install another puppet. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the purple cloak, diadem and ceremonial sword to Constantinople, formally acknowledging Zeno as the sole Roman emperor while requesting recognition as patricius and ruler of Italy. This calculated gesture demonstrated Odoacer's sophisticated understanding of political legitimacy and his desire to maintain continuity with Roman administrative traditions. Odoacer's kingdom represented a fascinating synthesis of Germanic military organization and Roman bureaucratic expertise. Rather than dismantling the existing administrative structure, he preserved the Roman civil service, maintaining the Praetorian Prefecture of Italy and continuing to appoint Roman senators to traditional magistracies. The Senate continued to convene in Rome, though its authority had become largely ceremonial. Provincial governors, many of whom were Romans, administered territories using established legal codes and tax collection systems. This administrative continuity proved crucial for maintaining economic stability during the transition period. The new ruler's military policies reflected the realities of governing a diverse population with limited resources. Germanic soldiers received land grants through the hospitalitas system, by which Roman landowners surrendered 1/3 of their estates to federate troops. This arrangement, while reducing Roman aristocratic wealth, avoided the complete displacement of the existing landowning class. Odoacer's army remained relatively small, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, but its strategic positioning in key fortified locations throughout northern and central Italy ensured effective control over major communication routes and urban centres. Odoacer's relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire evolved from initial cooperation to eventual conflict. Emperor Zeno initially recognized Odoacer's authority, granting him the title of patricius and acknowledging his de facto control over Italy. However, this arrangement became increasingly strained as Odoacer expanded his territorial ambitions. His conquest of Dalmatia in 481 AD brought him into direct conflict with Eastern imperial interests, while his intervention in the succession dispute following the death of the Visigothic king Euric further complicated diplomatic relations. The ecclesiastical dimension of Odoacer's rule proved equally complex. As an Arian Christian governing a predominantly Nicene population, he faced potential religious conflicts that could undermine his authority. However, Odoacer pursued a pragmatic policy of religious tolerance, maintaining cordial relations with Pope Felix III and allowing Catholic bishops to function without interference. He even supported papal diplomatic missions and contributed to church construction projects in Rome, recognizing that religious harmony served his political interests. Economic policies under Odoacer's administration demonstrated remarkable continuity with late imperial practices. The existing tax system remained largely intact, with Roman collectors continuing to gather revenues through traditional methods. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade networks, particularly those connecting Italy with Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, continued to function during this period. The maintenance of Roman coinage standards and the continued operation of imperial mints at Rome, Milan and Ravenna indicate that Odoacer understood the importance of monetary stability for commercial activity. The emergence of Theodoric the Great's Ostrogothic kingdom fundamentally altered the political landscape of late 5th century Italy. Emperor Zeno's decision to redirect Theodoric from the Balkans toward Italy reflected Byzantine strategic calculations rather than mere opportunism. Theodoric commanded a substantial force of approximately 100,000 Ostrogoths, including women, children, and elderly dependents, making his people a mobile nation seeking permanent settlement. Zeno's commission granted Theodoric authority to recover Italy for the empire, while simultaneously removing a potential threat from Constantinople's immediate vicinity. The military campaign that brought Theodoric to power unfolded over 4 years of intermittent warfare. The initial engagement at the Isonzo River in August 489 AD demonstrated the tactical superiority of Theodoric's heavily armed Gothic cavalry over Odoacer's more diverse forces. However, Odoacer's strategic withdrawal to fortified positions prolonged the conflict considerably. The siege of Milan lasted 8 months, during which both armies suffered from supply shortages and disease. Theodoric's victory at Verona in September 490 AD proved decisive, forcing Odoacer to retreat to his capital at Ravenna. The siege of Ravenna, lasting from 490 to 493 AD, became one of the most protracted military operations of the late imperial period. Ravenna's position amid marshlands and lagoons made direct assault impossible, while its connection to the Adriatic Sea through the port of Classis ensured continued access to supplies and reinforcements. Theodoric's forces constructed elaborate siege works, including a fortified camp at Pineta and naval blockades designed to isolate the city. The eventual resolution came through negotiation rather than military conquest, with both leaders agreeing to share power in a joint kingdom. The assassination of Odoacer at a banquet in Ravenna on March 15, 493 AD, eliminated the last obstacle to Theodoric's complete authority over Italy. Contemporary sources suggest that Theodoric personally struck the fatal blow, reportedly declaring that Odoacer had no bones in his body, as his sword cut through his rival's torso. This brutal conclusion to their power-sharing arrangement demonstrated that Theodoric had never intended to honour the negotiated settlement, viewing it merely as a tactical expedient to gain access to Ravenna's defences. Theodoric's administrative system represented the most sophisticated attempt to blend Germanic and Roman governmental traditions in post-imperial Europe. The Ostrogothic king retained the Roman Senate's ceremonial functions, while establishing a parallel Gothic administrative structure. Roman law continued to govern civilian populations, while Goths remained subject to their traditional legal customs. This dual system required careful coordination between Roman and Gothic officials, with Theodoric appointing trusted advisors like Cassiodorus to serve as intermediaries between the two administrative traditions. The king's court at Ravenna became a remarkable cultural synthesis, attracting scholars, artists, and administrators from throughout the Mediterranean world. Theodoric's palace complex, with its elaborate mosaics depicting both Christian and secular themes, physically embodied this cultural fusion. The famous mosaic of Theodoric's palace procession, though later altered to remove Gothic figures, originally demonstrated the king's desire to present himself as heir to both Roman imperial and Germanic royal traditions. Theodoric's military organisation reflected his understanding that effective governance required more than ceremonial authority. The Gothic army maintained its traditional structure of armed freemen serving under noble commanders, but Theodoric supplemented these forces with Roman units and foreign mercenaries. Garrison troops stationed in major cities included both Gothic and Roman soldiers, with command positions distributed between members of both communities. This integrated military structure helped prevent the ethnic tensions that had plagued other post-Roman kingdoms. The economic policies implemented during Theodoric's reign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of fiscal administration and commercial regulation. The king maintained Roman tax collection systems while introducing Gothic customs regarding military service obligations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Classi and Aquileia indicates continued commercial activity throughout the Mediterranean, with Italian merchants maintaining trading relationships with Constantinople, Alexandria, and Carthage. The preservation of Roman weights and measures facilitated this commercial continuity. Religious policy under Theodoric required delicate navigation between Gothic Arianism and Roman Catholicism. Unlike his predecessor, Theodoric faced more complex religious divisions within his own Gothic population, some of whom had converted to Catholicism during their residence in the Balkans. The king's initial policy of religious tolerance gradually gave way to increasing tensions, particularly regarding episcopal appointments and church property rights. His intervention in papal elections and his treatment of prominent Catholic senators like Boethius revealed the underlying instability of religious coexistence. The gradual fragmentation of centralized authority became apparent even during Theodoric's lifetime, despite his efforts to maintain unified control over the Italian peninsula. Regional commanders, both Gothic and Roman, began developing independent power bases that challenged royal authority. The emergence of local strongmen in areas like Tuscany and the Alpine regions reflected the practical difficulties of governing Italy's diverse geographical regions with limited administrative resources. Urban centres throughout Italy experienced varying degrees of continuity and transformation during this transitional period. Rome itself, though no longer an imperial capital, retained symbolic importance and substantial population. Archaeological evidence suggests that public buildings continued to function, though private construction declined significantly. Milan remained an important commercial centre, while newer cities like Ravenna and Pavia gained prominence as Gothic administrative centres. The relationship between urban populations and their new Germanic rulers varied considerably, with some cities maintaining greater autonomy than others. The emergence of local power structures that would characterise medieval Italian politics became increasingly evident as centralised authority weakened. Bishops began assuming greater temporal responsibilities, particularly in cities where Gothic garrisons were small or absent. Wealthy landowners consolidated their holdings and developed private military forces for protection against bandits and political rivals. These developments, while initially responses to immediate security concerns, established patterns of localized authority that would persist throughout the medieval period. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 AD exposed the fundamental weaknesses that had been accumulating beneath the surface of Ostrogothic rule in Italy. His successor, the 10-year-old Athalaric, ruled under the regency of his mother Amalasuntha, whose attempts to provide her son with a Roman education sparked fierce opposition from Gothic nobles who viewed such cultural assimilation as a betrayal of their martial traditions. The Regency period witnessed increasing factional disputes between Goths who favoured continued accommodation with Roman institutions and those who demanded a return to purely Germanic governance. These internal divisions created the political instability that Emperor Justinian I would exploit to justify his ambitious reconquest of the Western territories. Justinian's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Italy emerged from a complex combination of ideological conviction, strategic opportunity, and personal ambition. The emperor genuinely believed in the restoration of Roman territorial integrity, viewing the Germanic kingdoms as temporary aberrations that had illegitimately occupied imperial provinces. His legal codification projects, particularly the Corpus Juris Civilis, reflected this vision of renewed universal Roman law extending throughout the Mediterranean basin. The successful reconquest of Vandal Africa under Belisarius between 533 534 AD had demonstrated that determined military action could restore imperial control over lost territories, providing both practical experience and psychological momentum for the Italian campaign. The murder of Amalasuntha in 535 AD by her cousin Theodahad, who had usurped power after Athalaric's death, provided Justinian with the diplomatic pretext he required. Amalasuntha had maintained cordial relations with Constantinople and had even contemplated transferring sovereignty over Italy to the Eastern Empire before her assassination. Theodahad's violent seizure of power violated the diplomatic agreements that had regulated Gothic-Byzantine relations since Theodoric's reign, allowing Justinian to present his invasion as a legitimate response to Gothic aggression rather than unprovoked imperial expansion. Belisarius landed in Sicily with approximately 15,000 troops in the summer of 535 AD, initiating what would become a devastating 20-year conflict that would fundamentally transform the Italian peninsula. The initial campaign unfolded with remarkable speed, as Gothic garrisons in Sicily offered minimal resistance to the experienced veterans who had recently conquered Vandal Africa. The capture of Syracuse and Palermo demonstrated the effectiveness of combined land and naval operations, with Byzantine ships providing crucial logistical support and preventing Gothic reinforcements from reaching the island. Within months, Belisarius had secured Sicily as a staging ground for the assault on mainland Italy. The Gothic response to the Byzantine invasion revealed the internal weaknesses that had been developing within Theodoric's kingdom. Theodahad proved incapable of organising effective military resistance, spending crucial months in futile diplomatic negotiations, while Byzantine forces consolidated their positions. Gothic nobles, recognising their king's incompetence, murdered Theodahad in 536 AD and elected Witiges as his replacement. However, this leadership change occurred too late to prevent Belisarius from establishing secure footholds in southern Italy and beginning his advance towards Rome. The siege of Rome in 538 AD became the first major test of Byzantine determination and Gothic resilience. Witiges assembled a massive army estimated at 150,000 warriors, including contingents from Gothic settlements throughout Italy and allied Germanic tribes from beyond the Alps. The Gothic king's strategy focused on isolating Rome from Byzantine supply lines while using his numerical superiority to overwhelm the city's defences through sustained assault. However, Belisarius had spent months strengthening Rome's fortifications, repairing damage to the Aurelian walls and establishing defensive positions at crucial gates and bridges. The Gothic assault on Rome demonstrated both the tactical evolution of siege warfare and the continued importance of traditional Roman defensive architecture. Witiges constructed elaborate siege engines, including massive towers and battering rams, while his archers maintained continuous pressure on the city's defenders. The famous attack on the Salarian Gate involved coordinated assaults by multiple Gothic columns, with warriors advancing under protective shields while engineers attempted to undermine the wall's foundations. Belisarius personally directed the defence, utilising his superior cavalry to conduct devastating sorties against Gothic siege works and supply convoys. The psychological impact of the siege extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For Romans throughout Italy, the spectacle of barbarian armies besieging the Eternal City evoked memories of earlier Germanic invasions and raised fundamental questions about the restoration of imperial authority. Many Roman aristocrats who had initially welcomed Byzantine intervention, began questioning whether Justinian's forces could actually provide effective protection against Gothic retaliation. The prolonged nature of the siege, lasting over a year, demonstrated that neither side possessed the overwhelming military advantage necessary for decisive victory. Relief came through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manoeuvring that highlighted the complex nature of 6th century warfare. Byzantine naval forces operating from bases in southern Italy gradually severed Gothic supply lines, while Belisarius's cavalry raids disrupted agricultural production in the surrounding countryside. Simultaneously, Justinian's diplomats negotiated with Frankish kings to threaten Gothic territories north of the Alps, forcing Witigis to divide his attention between multiple fronts. The Gothic king's decision to abandon the siege in March 538 AD resulted from these accumulated pressures rather than any single decisive engagement. The subsequent phase of the Gothic Wars witnessed a fundamental shift in tactical approaches as both sides adapted to the realities of prolonged conflict. Witigis concentrated his remaining forces in heavily fortified positions, particularly the capital at Ravenna, and strategic strongholds like Oximus and Faesulae. This defensive strategy aimed to exhaust Byzantine resources while maintaining Gothic control over key administrative centres and agricultural regions. Belisarius responded by implementing a systematic campaign of siege warfare, methodically reducing Gothic strongholds while avoiding costly direct confrontations with concentrated enemy forces. The siege of Oximus in 539 AD exemplified the brutal nature of this attritional warfare. The fortress, positioned on a nearly impregnable rocky outcrop, had been strengthened with additional walls and provisioned for extended resistance. Belisarius surrounded the position with elaborate siege works, including contravallationary walls designed to prevent Gothic relief attempts. The siege lasted 18 months, during which both sides suffered enormous casualties from combat, disease, and starvation. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of the siege's intensity, including arrowheads, catapult stones, and human remains bearing marks of violent death. The capture of Ravenna in 540 AD marked the apparent conclusion of the first phase of Byzantine reconquest, though the victory proved more complicated than initially anticipated. Witigis, isolated in his capital and facing internal opposition from Gothic nobles who blamed him for military disasters, entered into surrender negotiations with Belisarius. However, the terms of capitulation became controversial when Gothic envoys suggested that Belisarius might proclaim himself Western Emperor rather than simply serving as Justinian's representative. While Belisarius ultimately rejected this proposal and transported Witigis to Constantinople as a prisoner, the incident revealed the persistent appeal of independent imperial authority in Italy. The temporary Byzantine triumph proved ephemeral as new Gothic leadership emerged to continue resistance against imperial restoration. Ildibad, elected king by Gothic nobles in 541 AD, initiated a guerrilla campaign that exploited the mountainous terrain of northern Italy and the limited size of Byzantine occupation forces. His assassination after less than a year in power led to the election of Eraric, whose attempts to negotiate surrender with Constantinople resulted in his own murder by Gothic hardliners. This cycle of violence demonstrated the fundamental divisions within Gothic society regarding accommodation with Byzantine rule. The emergence of Totila as Gothic king in 541 AD transformed the character of the Italian resistance and initiated the most destructive phase of the entire conflict. Unlike his predecessors, Totila combined exceptional military talent with sophisticated political strategy, appealing directly to Italian populations who had become disillusioned with Byzantine administration. His early victories at Faenza and Mugello demonstrated tactical innovations that neutralized Byzantine advantages in cavalry and siege warfare. Totila's forces employed hit-and-run tactics, avoiding direct confrontation while systematically destroying Byzantine supply lines and isolated garrisons. Totila's social policies proved equally revolutionary, challenging traditional hierarchical relationships that had persisted since the Roman period. The Gothic king redistributed confiscated estates to his followers while simultaneously appealing to Italian peasants and slaves with promises of improved conditions under Gothic rule. His decision to reduce taxes and eliminate certain forms of compulsory labour won significant support among rural populations who had suffered under both Gothic and Byzantine extraction. These policies created a genuine popular base for continued resistance that previous Gothic kings had failed to achieve. The recapture of Rome by Totila in 546 AD represented the nadir of Byzantine fortunes in Italy and demonstrated the inadequacy of Justinian's military commitment to Italian reconquest. The Gothic king's forces infiltrated the city through poorly defended sections of the Aurelian walls, overwhelming the small Byzantine garrison and forcing the evacuation of most civilian inhabitants. Totila's treatment of Rome reflected his complex relationship with Roman traditions, as he simultaneously respected the city's symbolic importance while threatening to destroy its physical infrastructure to prevent future Byzantine occupation. Justinian's response to these military disasters revealed both his determination to maintain the reconquest and his recognition that previous strategies had proven insufficient. The emperor dispatched substantial reinforcements under the command of his nephew Germanus, while simultaneously initiating diplomatic contacts with Frankish kingdoms to open additional fronts against Gothic resistance. However, Germanus's death from illness in 550 AD before reaching Italy forced Justinian to rely once again on Belisarius, who had spent the intervening years campaigning against Persian forces in the east. Belisarius's second Italian campaign, beginning in 544 AD, unfolded under dramatically different circumstances than his initial conquest. The general commanded significantly smaller forces and faced a Gothic kingdom that had adapted effectively to Byzantine tactical methods. His recapture of Rome in 547 AD proved temporary, as insufficient garrison forces and inadequate fortifications allowed Totila to retake the city within months. This cycle of capture and recapture demonstrated the fundamental problem facing Byzantine strategy. Territorial conquest required sustained occupation by substantial military forces that Justinian was unwilling or unable to provide. The appointment of Narses as supreme commander of Italian operations in 551 AD marked Justinian's final attempt to achieve decisive victory through overwhelming military force. Narses, an elderly eunuch who had previously served as palace chamberlain, possessed extensive administrative experience and commanded the largest Byzantine army yet assembled for Italian operations. His forces included not only traditional Roman units, but also substantial contingents of Lombard and Gepid federates, whose familiarity with Germanic tactical methods proved crucial in confronting Gothic resistance. The Battle of Taginae in 552 AD finally broke the back of Gothic resistance through a combination of tactical innovation and numerical superiority. Narses positioned his forces in a defensive formation that channeled Gothic cavalry charges into prepared killing zones, while his Lombard allies conducted flanking maneuvers that disrupted enemy formations. Totila's death during the battle eliminated the most capable Gothic leader and demoralized resistance forces throughout central Italy. The subsequent Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553 AD completed the destruction of organized Gothic resistance, though isolated strongholds continued to hold out for several additional years. The pragmatic sanction issued by Justinian in 554 AD established the legal framework for restored imperial administration in Italy, though the document's provisions reveal the enormous challenges facing Byzantine governance. The emperor promised to restore confiscated properties to their original owners, while simultaneously honouring land grants made by Gothic kings to their followers. This contradictory commitment proved impossible to implement effectively, creating legal disputes that persisted throughout the Byzantine period. The sanctions provisions regarding taxation and military service obligations reflected Justinian's recognition that Italy's devastated condition required modified administrative approaches. The human and material costs of the Gothic wars defied contemporary comprehension and established patterns of destruction that would influence Italian development for centuries. Procopius estimated that the conflict had reduced Italy's population by more than half, though modern historians consider this figure exaggerated. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the peninsula confirms widespread urban abandonment and rural depopulation during the mid-6th century. The destruction of aqueducts, roads, and other infrastructure elements that had supported classical civilization proved particularly devastating for long-term recovery prospects. The establishment of the Exarchate of Ravenna in 584 AD represented Justinian's successor, Maurice's attempt to create a more effective administrative structure for governing Italy's reduced Byzantine territories. The exarch combined civil and military authority in a single office, reflecting the reality that successful governance required constant military vigilance against external threats and internal rebellion. Ravenna's selection as the administrative centre acknowledged both its strategic importance and its symbolic connection to the Gothic kingdom that Byzantine forces had destroyed. However, even as Narses celebrated his victories over Gothic resistance, new threats were already emerging that would fundamentally alter the strategic situation in Italy. Lombard warriors, who had served as Byzantine federates during the final phases of the Gothic wars, possessed detailed knowledge of Italian geography, military dispositions, and political weaknesses. Their king, Alboin, had observed the devastation wrought by 20 years of continuous warfare and recognised the opportunity that Italy's weakened condition presented for Germanic conquest and settlement. The Lombard invasion of 568 AD began not as a coordinated military campaign, but as a massive population movement that included warriors, families, and entire tribal communities seeking permanent settlement in the fertile plains of northern Italy. Alboin's forces crossed the Julian Alps in the spring of 568 AD, encountering minimal resistance from Byzantine garrisons that had been reduced to skeleton strength following the conclusion of the Gothic Wars. The rapid capture of Forum Julii provided the Lombards with a secure base for subsequent operations and demonstrated the inadequacy of existing defensive arrangements. The Lombard kingdom's territorial expansion under Desiderius had reached a critical juncture by the 770 SAD, with Lombard forces pressing dangerously close to Rome itself and threatening to complete the conquest of central Italy that had eluded their predecessors for 2 centuries. Pope Hadrian I, confronted with the imminent collapse of the remaining Byzantine territories that served as a buffer between Lombard domains and papal patrimony, dispatched urgent appeals across the Alps to the Frankish court. These diplomatic entreaties, carried by papal legates through treacherous mountain passes during the harsh winter of 773-774 AD, represented the culmination of a carefully orchestrated papal strategy to replace Byzantine protection with Frankish military intervention. Charlemagne's decision to cross the Alps with a substantial Frankish army in the spring of 774 AD emerged from calculations that extended far beyond immediate papal concerns. The Frankish king had spent the previous decade consolidating his authority over territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, establishing administrative systems that required continuous territorial expansion to satisfy the land hunger of his aristocratic supporters. The Lombard kingdom, with its fertile Po valley plains and established urban centres, represented an irresistible target for Frankish expansion, particularly particularly given the diplomatic justification provided by papal appeals for assistance against Lombard aggression. The Frankish invasion force that assembled at Geneva during the early months of 774 AD comprised approximately 40,000 warriors drawn from throughout the expanding Carolingian realm. Unlike the smaller, more mobile armies that had characterized earlier Germanic invasions, Charlemagne's host included substantial contingents of heavy cavalry equipped with the stirrup technology that had revolutionized Frankish military effectiveness. The army's logistical train stretched for miles, carrying siege equipment, provisions, and the administrative personnel necessary to establish immediate governmental control over conquered territories. Desiderius had anticipated the Frankish invasion and positioned his forces to exploit the natural defensive advantages offered by the Alpine passes and the fortified positions that controlled access to the Lombard heartland. The Lombard king's strategy centered on the fortress of Susa, which commanded the primary route through the Montseny Pass and had been strengthened with additional walls and provisioned for extended siege. Lombard engineers had constructed elaborate obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones, while mounted scouts maintained surveillance over alternative routes that might allow Frankish forces to bypass the main defensive positions. However, Charlemagne's tactical approach demonstrated the sophisticated military planning that had enabled Frankish expansion throughout Western Europe. Rather than launching direct assaults against prepared Lombard positions, the Frankish king divided his forces into multiple columns that simultaneously threatened several Alpine passes. This strategy forced Desiderius to disperse his limited military resources while preventing the Lombards from concentrating their defensive efforts at any single point. The diversionary attacks at the Great St. Bernard Pass drew significant Lombard forces away from Susa, creating the opportunity for the main Frankish army to force the Montseny passage through a combination of frontal pressure and flanking manoeuvres. The breakthrough at Susa in June 774 AD collapsed Lombard resistance throughout the Western Alps and opened the Po Valley to Frankish occupation. Desiderius, recognizing that his dispersed forces could not effectively contest Frankish control over the northern Italian plains, withdrew his remaining troops to the fortified capital at Pavia, while ordering the destruction of bridges and supply depots that might assist the advancing enemy. This scorched earth strategy reflected the Lombard king's understanding that prolonged siege warfare represented his only remaining hope for successful resistance, as winter conditions would eventually force the Franks to withdraw or face catastrophic supply shortages. The siege of Pavia, beginning in September 774 AD and lasting through the following spring, became one of the most significant military operations of the early medieval period. Charlemagne's forces constructed elaborate siege works that completely encircled the city, including contravallatory walls designed to prevent relief attempts and sophisticated engineering projects that diverted watercourses to undermine Pavia's defensive positions. The Frankish camp evolved into a temporary city housing thousands of warriors, support personnel, and the growing administrative apparatus required to govern conquered Lombard territories. Archaeological excavations at Pavia have revealed the intensity of the siege operations, with evidence of sustained bombardment from catapults and other siege engines. The discovery of arrowheads bearing Frankish manufacturing marks alongside Lombard defensive equipment illustrates the technological sophistication of 8th century siege warfare. Excavated food remains suggest that both besiegers and defenders suffered from supply shortages during the harsh winter of 775 AD, though Frankish control over the surrounding countryside ultimately proved decisive in determining the siege's outcome. Desiderius' surrender in June 775 AD marked the end of independent Lombard political authority in northern Italy, and established Frankish control over territories that would form the core of the medieval Kingdom of Italy. The Lombard king's capitulation terms reflected both Charlemagne's political sophistication and his understanding of the administrative challenges involved in governing a recently conquered territory. Rather than executing Desiderius or permitting his forces to conduct a final desperate defence, Charlemagne negotiated a peaceful surrender that preserved Pavia's urban infrastructure and maintained the cooperation of Lombard administrative personnel who possessed essential knowledge of local governmental systems. The integration of the former Lombard kingdom into the expanding Carolingian realm required careful balance between Frankish political control and accommodation of existing Italian institutions. Charlemagne retained the title Rex Langobardorum, presenting himself as the legitimate successor to Lombard royal authority, rather than a foreign conqueror imposing alien governmental systems. This approach facilitated the cooperation of Lombard nobles who might otherwise have organised continued resistance, while simultaneously maintaining administrative continuity that proved essential for effective taxation and military recruitment. The establishment of Frankish administrative control over northern Italy revealed the sophisticated governmental systems that Charlemagne had developed during his earlier conquests in Saxony and Aquitaine. Frankish counts, appointed directly by the king and responsible for implementing royal policy at the local level, replaced Lombard dukes in major cities like Milan, Brescia, and Verona. However, these Frankish administrators worked closely with existing Italian personnel who possessed detailed knowledge of local customs, legal traditions, and economic relationships that proved essential for effective governance. The legal framework governing the new Frankish territories reflected Charlemagne's recognition that successful administration required accommodation of diverse legal traditions rather than imposition of uniform Frankish law. Lombard legal codes continued to govern relationships between Italian subjects, while Frankish law applied to members of the conquering aristocracy and their dependents. This dual legal system created complex jurisdictional questions that required careful adjudication by royal officials, but it also facilitated the gradual integration of Italian and Frankish legal traditions that would characterize medieval Italian jurisprudence. Economic policies implemented in the conquered territories demonstrated Charlemagne's understanding that sustained political control required the maintenance of existing commercial relationships and productive capacity. Italian merchants retained their traditional trading privileges throughout the Mediterranean, while Frankish protection of major trade routes enhanced commercial security and encouraged expanded economic activity. Archaeological evidence from sites like Comacchio and Venice indicates continued prosperity in Italian commercial centres during the early years of Frankish rule, suggesting that the conquest had not disrupted fundamental economic relationships. The military organisation of Frankish Italy reflected both the strategic requirements of governing a recently conquered territory and the broader military reforms that Charlemagne was implementing throughout his expanding realm. Lombard warriors who submitted to Frankish authority retained their traditional military obligations, but served under Frankish commanders who ensured loyalty to Carolingian interests. Strategic fortifications at key locations like the Brenner Pass and the approaches to major cities housed mixed garrisons of Frankish and Italian troops, creating integrated military units that could respond effectively to both external threats and internal rebellion. Religious policies in conquered Italy required particularly delicate handling, given the complex relationships between Lombard Arianism, Catholic Orthodoxy, and papal authority that had characterized the previous century of Italian political development. Charlemagne's strong support for Catholic Christianity and his alliance with the papacy provided important legitimacy for Frankish rule among Italian populations, who had often viewed Lombard kings with suspicion due to their religious policies. The king's generous donations to Roman churches and his public demonstrations of religious devotion helped establish his credentials as a legitimate Christian ruler rather than merely a successful military conqueror. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800 AD represented the culmination of political developments that had been building since the initial Frankish intervention in Italian affairs. The ceremony itself, conducted in the Basilica of St. Peter before an assembly that included Frankish nobles, Roman clergy and Italian aristocrats, symbolically restored the imperial title in Western Europe while establishing a new relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority. Contemporary accounts describe the elaborate ritual elements that emphasized both the religious significance of imperial coronation and the political alliance between Frankish military power and papal spiritual authority. The imperial coronation's immediate political consequences extended far beyond its ceremonial significance, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the Mediterranean world. The Byzantine Empire, which had maintained theoretical claims to imperial authority over all former Roman territories, found itself confronted with a rival imperial title that possessed both military credibility and ecclesiastical legitimacy. The new Western Empire's territorial extent, stretching from the Elbe River to the Pyrenees and from the North Sea to central Italy, represented a concentration of political authority that had not existed in Western Europe since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire more than 3 centuries earlier. The administrative structure of the revived Western Empire required sophisticated coordination between the traditional Frankish governmental systems and the diverse institutional arrangements that existed throughout the expanded Carolingian territories. The Kingdom of Italy, established as a constituent element of the larger imperial structure, maintained its own administrative identity while remaining subordinate to overall Carolingian authority. This arrangement allowed Charlemagne to govern Italian territories through established local institutions, while ensuring that ultimate political control remained concentrated in Frankish hands. The appointment of Charlemagne's son Pepin as King of Italy in 781 AD represented an attempt to provide more direct royal attention to Italian affairs while maintaining the unity of the broader Carolingian realm. The young king established his court at Pavia, the former Lombard capital, and worked to integrate Italian aristocratic families into the expanding Carolingian governmental system. Pepin's marriage alliances with prominent Italian noble families created kinship networks that helped consolidate Frankish authority while providing Italian elites with access to the patronage opportunities that membership in the Carolingian aristocracy provided. However, the death of Pepin in 810 AD created succession problems that would ultimately contribute to the fragmentation of Carolingian authority in Italy. Charlemagne's decision to transfer the Italian kingdom to his grandson Bernard reflected the emperor's commitment to maintaining unified family control over the diverse territories that comprised the Carolingian Empire. Bernard's youth and inexperience, however, made him dependent on advisors whose loyalty to broader Carolingian interests proved questionable as political pressures mounted following Charlemagne's death in 814 AD. The reign of Louis the Pious as emperor revealed the fundamental structural weaknesses that had been developing within the Carolingian governmental system, despite its impressive territorial extent and administrative sophistication. Louis's attempts to regularize succession arrangements through the Ordinatio Imperii of 817 AD created conflicts with his sons who demanded greater autonomy over their designated kingdoms. The civil wars that erupted during the 830s and 840s AD demonstrated that the Carolingian Empire's unity depended heavily on the personal authority of individual rulers rather than institutional mechanisms that could survive political transitions. The rebellion of Bernard of Italy in 817 AD illustrated the specific challenges facing Carolingian authority in territories that retained strong regional identities and institutional traditions. Bernard's attempt to maintain independent royal authority over Italy attracted support from Italian nobles who viewed the young king as a more legitimate representative of their interests than distant Carolingian emperors. The brutal suppression of this rebellion, including Bernard's execution and the punishment of his supporters, created lasting resentment among Italian aristocratic families who had previously cooperated with Frankish rule. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD formally acknowledged the political fragmentation that had been developing within the Carolingian Empire since Louis the Pious's death. The division of imperial territories between Louis's surviving sons created separate kingdoms that maintained nominal recognition of imperial unity while pursuing increasingly independent policies. Italy's assignment to Lothair as part of the Middle Kingdom reflected both the territory's strategic importance and the complex geographical challenges involved in governing territories that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The death of Charles the Fat in 888 AD shattered the last vestiges of unified Carolingian authority over Italy, and ushered in a period of unprecedented political fragmentation that would define the peninsula's character for the next century. Unlike the relatively orderly succession disputes that had characterized earlier Carolingian transitions, Charles's demise created a complete power vacuum in which no single claimant possessed sufficient military strength or political legitimacy to establish undisputed control over the Italian kingdom. The deposition of the emperor by his own nobles in 887 AD had already demonstrated the hollowness of Carolingian authority, but his death removed even the pretense of imperial unity that had provided a framework for political organisation throughout the 9th century. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death witnessed the emergence of multiple competing claimants to the Italian crown, each representing different power bases and political strategies. Berengar I, Margrave of Friuli, possessed perhaps the strongest initial position due to his control over the strategic northeastern territories that commanded the Alpine passes connecting Italy with the Germanic lands beyond. His Carolingian bloodline, derived from his grandfather King Pepin of Italy, provided important legitimacy claims that resonated with Italian nobles who valued continuity with established dynastic traditions. However, Berengar's territorial base in Friuli, while strategically located, lacked the agricultural wealth and urban centres necessary to support the extensive military campaigns required for conquest of the entire peninsula. Guy III of Spoleto emerged as Berengar's primary rival, commanding substantial military resources through his control over the powerful Duchy of Spoleto and his extensive kinship networks throughout central Italy. Guy's family had governed Spoleto for generations, accumulating vast landed wealth and developing sophisticated administrative systems that enabled them to mobilize military forces more effectively than many of their contemporaries. His marriage alliances with prominent Roman noble families provided access to the political networks that controlled papal elections and influenced ecclesiastical policy throughout central Italy. The Duke's strategic position in the Apennine Mountains allowed him to threaten both northern and southern Italy, while maintaining secure defensive positions that could withstand sustained siege operations. The initial military confrontations between these rival claimants revealed the transformed nature of Italian warfare in the post-Carolingian period. Unlike the massive armies that Charlemagne had deployed during his conquest of the Lombard kingdom, the forces available to late 9th century Italian rulers consisted primarily of personal retinues, local militias, and temporary alliances between regional magnates. Berengar's army at the Battle of the Brenta in 899 AD numbered perhaps 8,000 warriors, a force that would have been considered modest by earlier Carolingian standards, but represented a substantial military commitment for a regional Italian ruler. The composition of these armies reflected the localization of military power, with heavily armed cavalry forming the core of aristocratic forces, while foot soldiers were recruited from urban militias and rural populations subject to specific lords. The tactical methods employed during these conflicts demonstrated both continuity with Carolingian military traditions and adaptation to the realities of localized warfare. Heavy cavalry remained the dominant battlefield force, with armoured horsemen wielding lances and swords in coordinated charges designed to break enemy formations through shock impact. However, the limited size of available forces required greater tactical flexibility than had characterized earlier large-scale military operations. Commanders increasingly relied on rapid maneuvers, surprise attacks, and the exploitation of geographical advantages rather than the prolonged siege operations that had defined Charlemagne's Italian campaigns. The role of fortified positions became increasingly critical as political authority fragmented and military resources diminished. Castles and fortified towns served not merely as defensive refuges, but as centres of territorial administration and economic control that enabled local strongmen to maintain independent power bases. The reconstruction of ancient Roman fortifications at sites like Verona and Pavia reflected the understanding that effective political control required secure administrative centres that could withstand military pressure from rival claimants. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals extensive construction and renovation of defensive works throughout northern and central Italy, indicating that local rulers were investing substantial resources in fortification projects. Guy of Spoleto's coronation as King of Italy in 889 AD represented a significant victory for central Italian political networks over their northern counterparts, though his authority remained contested and geographically limited. The ceremony, conducted by Pope Stephen V in Rome, provided important ecclesiastical legitimacy that distinguished Guy from purely military usurpers. However, the papal coronation also demonstrated the extent to which Italian political authority had become dependent on ecclesiastical approval, a development that would have profound consequences for the relationship between secular and religious power throughout the medieval period. Guy's royal title carried limited practical authority beyond the territories he could control through direct military force, revealing the gap between theoretical sovereignty and actual political power that characterized this period. The emergence of Hugh of Provence as a major claimant to Italian authority during the 920 SAD illustrated the continued attractiveness of the Italian kingdom to ambitious rulers from beyond the Alps. Hugh's territorial base in Provence provided access to Mediterranean trade networks and substantial agricultural resources that enabled him to finance military campaigns in Italy while maintaining secure lines of communication with potential allies in France and Burgundy. His initial interventions in Italian politics occurred at the invitation of Italian nobles who sought external military assistance in their conflicts with local rivals, demonstrating the persistent appeal of foreign intervention as a solution to domestic political disputes. Hugh's marriage to Marozia, the powerful Roman noblewoman who effectively controlled papal elections during the early 10th century, represented a sophisticated attempt to combine military conquest with political alliance. Marozia's family, the Theophylacta, had accumulated enormous influence over ecclesiastical appointments and Roman urban politics, making her cooperation essential for any ruler seeking to establish legitimate authority over central Italy. The marriage alliance provided Hugh with access to Roman political networks, while offering Marozia's family the military protection necessary to maintain their dominant position against rival noble factions. The reign of Hugh of Provence as King of Italy from 926 to 947 AD demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of royal authority during this period of political fragmentation. Hugh succeeded in establishing more extensive territorial control than his immediate predecessors, governing directly over substantial portions of northern and central Italy through a combination of military force and political accommodation with local power holders. His court at Pavia attracted scholars, administrators, and ecclesiastical officials who provided the expertise necessary for effective governmental operations, suggesting that royal institutions retained considerable vitality despite the broader context of political instability. However, Hugh's authority remained constantly challenged by regional magnates who possessed independent military resources and territorial bases that enabled them to resist royal demands. The Margraves of Tuscany, controlling the wealthy territories between the Arno and Tiber rivers, maintained virtual independence throughout Hugh's reign despite nominal acknowledgement of his royal authority. Their control over major trade routes connecting northern Italy with Rome and the Mediterranean provided substantial revenues that supported private armies capable of resisting royal military pressure. The Margravial court at Lucca functioned as an alternative centre of political authority that attracted nobles and ecclesiastical officials who sought to avoid dependence on royal patronage. The Dukes of Spoleto similarly maintained autonomous authority over their traditional territories, despite the broader political changes occurring throughout Italy. The mountainous terrain of the central Apennines provided natural defensive advantages that made sustained military campaigns against Spoleto extremely difficult and expensive. The duchy's strategic position, controlling major routes between northern and southern Italy, enabled its rulers to extract substantial revenues from commercial traffic while maintaining the military forces necessary to defend their independence. Archaeological evidence from Spoleto during this period reveals continued urban prosperity and extensive construction projects that suggest the duchy's rulers possessed substantial financial resources despite their conflicts with various royal claimants. The increasing influence of the Roman nobility in papal elections represented one of the most significant developments of this period, fundamentally altering the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority throughout Italy. Families like the Theophylacti and the Crescentii accumulated sufficient military and economic power to effectively control the selection of popes, transforming the papacy from an independent spiritual authority into an instrument of Roman aristocratic politics. The election of family members and political allies to the papal throne enabled these noble factions to direct ecclesiastical resources toward their secular political objectives while using papal authority to legitimize their territorial ambitions. The moral consequences of this political control over papal elections proved devastating for ecclesiastical prestige throughout Western Europe. The reign of Pope John XIV, elected through the influence of his grandmother Marozia, exemplified the corruption that resulted from treating ecclesiastical offices as instruments of secular political advancement. Contemporary chroniclers described papal courts that resembled aristocratic households more than centres of spiritual authority, with ecclesiastical revenues supporting military campaigns and political alliances rather than religious activities. The transformation of the Lateran Palace into what critics described as a brothel reflected the complete subordination of spiritual concerns to secular political calculations. This decline in papal moral authority had profound implications for the broader political development of Italy during the 10th century. The papacy's traditional role as an independent mediator between competing secular authorities became impossible to maintain when popes themselves were perceived as representatives of particular noble factions. The ecclesiastical legitimacy that had previously provided important support for royal authority lost much of its effectiveness when papal endorsements were understood to reflect political calculations rather than spiritual judgments. This development forced secular rulers to rely more heavily on military force and direct political accommodation with local power holders, rather than appealing to ecclesiastical authority for legitimacy. The emergence of the Ottoman dynasty in Germany during the 930 SAD created new opportunities and challenges for Italian political development. Otto I's consolidation of authority over the Germanic territories beyond the Alps provided him with military resources that far exceeded those available to Italian rulers, making German intervention in Italian affairs an increasingly attractive option for local magnates seeking external support against their rivals. The traditional connections between Italy and the Germanic lands, dating back to Charlemagne's conquests, facilitated diplomatic contacts that enabled Italian nobles to appeal for German military assistance while offering territorial concessions and political alliance in return. The military technology and tactical methods employed during this period reflected both the continuation of Carolingian traditions and adaptation to the changing political circumstances that characterized post-imperial Italy. The development of improved castle fortifications, including the construction of stone keeps and more sophisticated defensive works, responded to the increased importance of fortified positions in localized warfare. The evolution of cavalry equipment, particularly improvements in armor and weapons technology, reflected the continued dominance of mounted warriors in Italian military operations. Archaeological discoveries of 10th century military equipment reveal sophisticated craftsmanship and standardized production methods that suggest the existence of specialized armaments industries serving the military needs of competing political authorities. The economic foundations of political power during this period underwent significant transformation as traditional royal revenues declined and local magnates developed independent sources of wealth. Control over major trade routes became increasingly important as commercial activity recovered from the disruptions of the 9th century. The Margraves of Tuscany derived substantial revenues from their control over routes connecting northern Italy with Rome and the Mediterranean ports, enabling them to maintain military forces and administrative systems that rivaled those of royal authorities. Similarly, the development of agricultural estates worked by dependent peasant populations provided regional magnates with the economic foundation necessary to support independent political ambitions. Urban centres throughout Italy experienced varying degrees of autonomy and political development during this period of weakened royal authority. Cities like Milan, Venice and Genoa began developing independent governmental institutions that enabled them to pursue their own political and economic interests without direct royal supervision. The emergence of merchant guilds and urban militias reflected the growing political consciousness of commercial populations who possessed the economic resources necessary to support independent political action. These urban developments would prove crucial for the later emergence of the Italian city-state system, though during the 10th century they remained subordinate to the broader context of aristocratic political competition. The fragmentation of political authority throughout Italy during this period created opportunities for external intervention that would ultimately reshape the peninsula's political development. The weakness of Italian royal authority and the constant conflicts between regional magnates made foreign military intervention an attractive option for ambitious rulers seeking to expand their territorial control. The invitation extended to Otto I by Italian nobles seeking German military assistance against their local rivals represented a continuation of the pattern of foreign intervention that had characterized Italian politics since the Carolingian conquest, though the specific circumstances and consequences would prove significantly different from earlier examples of external involvement in Italian affairs. The diplomatic mission that departed from Rome in the autumn of 961 AD represented far more than a routine papal appeal for military assistance against regional threats. Pope John XIV's envoys, travelling through the treacherous Alpine passes as winter approached, carried with them the imperial crown that had remained dormant since the fragmentation of Carolingian authority nearly a century earlier. Their destination was the Saxon court of Otto I, whose recent victories over the Magyars at Lechfeld and consolidation of authority over the German duchies had established him as the most formidable military power north of the Alps. The papal invitation to intervene in Italian affairs offered Otto the opportunity to claim the imperial title that would transform his regional German kingdom into a universal Christian empire spanning Central Europe. Otto's decision to accept the papal invitation emerged from strategic calculations that extended far beyond immediate military considerations. The Saxon king had spent 2 decades constructing a governmental system that required continuous expansion to satisfy the territorial ambitions of his aristocratic supporters, while providing the resources necessary to maintain his expensive military establishment. The German duchies, despite their formal submission to Ottonian authority, retained substantial autonomous power that could threaten royal control if not channeled toward external conquest rather than internal rebellion. The Italian kingdom, with its wealthy urban centres and established administrative traditions, represented an irresistible target for Saxon expansion, particularly given the diplomatic legitimacy provided by papal appeals for assistance against local tyrants. The military force that assembled at Augsburg during the winter of 961-962 AD demonstrated the sophisticated organisational capabilities that had enabled Ottonian expansion throughout Central Europe. Otto's army comprised approximately 25,000 warriors drawn from throughout the German realm, including heavily armed Saxon cavalry, Swabian infantry contingents, and Bavarian mountain specialists experienced in alpine warfare. The expedition's logistical requirements dwarfed those of earlier German interventions in Italian affairs, necessitating elaborate supply arrangements and the construction of temporary bridges and road improvements to accommodate the massive baggage trains carrying siege equipment, provisions, and the administrative personnel necessary to establish immediate governmental control over conquered territories. The crossing of the Brenner Pass in February 962 AD unfolded with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating both the careful planning that had preceded the expedition and the military discipline that characterized Ottonian forces. Unlike the chaotic invasions that had marked earlier Germanic incursions into Italy, Otto's advance proceeded according to predetermined schedules that coordinated the movement of multiple army columns with supply convoys and diplomatic missions sent ahead to negotiate the surrender of Italian strongholds. The rapid capture of Trento and Verona eliminated potential centres of resistance in the Alpine foothills, while securing the crucial communication routes that connected the advancing German forces with their homeland bases. Berengar II's response to the German invasion revealed the fundamental weakness of Italian royal authority that had persisted since the collapse of Carolingian unity. The Italian king commanded limited military resources and possessed virtually no support among the regional magnates who had invited Otto's intervention specifically to overthrow Berengar's increasingly oppressive rule. His retreat to the fortress of San Leo in the Apennine Mountains represented acknowledgement that direct military confrontation with German forces would result in catastrophic defeat. The fortress, positioned on an virtually impregnable rocky outcrop and provisioned for extended siege, offered Berengar's only hope for survival, until political circumstances might shift in his favour. The German occupation of Pavia in March 962 AD marked Otto's assumption of the Italian royal title and established the foundation for his subsequent imperial coronation. The ceremony conducted in the former Lombard capital deliberately evoked Charlemagne's earlier conquest, while emphasising the continuity between Carolingian and Ottonian authority over Italian territories. Otto's decision to maintain the existing Italian administrative structure while appointing German officials to key positions demonstrated his understanding that effective governance required accommodation of local institutions rather than a wholesale replacement of established governmental systems. The preservation of Italian legal codes and the retention of experienced administrators facilitated the transition to German rule while maintaining the bureaucratic expertise necessary for effective taxation and territorial administration. The imperial coronation ceremony conducted by Pope John XIV in St. Peter's Basilica on February 2, 962 AD, represented the culmination of political developments that had been building since the initial German intervention in Italian affairs. The elaborate ritual, witnessed by an assembly that included German nobles, Italian aristocrats, and Roman clergy, symbolically restored the imperial dignity in Western Europe while establishing a new relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority. Contemporary accounts describe the magnificent procession that accompanied Otto from his temporary palace to the basilica, with the king-elect wearing traditional Lombard royal regalia, while German warriors lined the route through Rome's ancient streets. The actual coronation ritual followed established precedents dating back to Charlemagne's elevation, with the Pope placing the imperial crown upon Otto's head while proclaiming him as the divinely appointed ruler of the restored Western Empire. The The immediate consequences of Otto's imperial coronation extended far beyond its ceremonial significance, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout Europe and establishing the institutional framework that would govern German-Italian relations for the next 3 centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, as it would later be known, combined the military resources of the German kingdom with the symbolic prestige of imperial authority and the territorial wealth of northern Italy. This concentration of political power represented the most significant challenge to Byzantine claims of universal imperial authority since the rise of Charlemagne, while simultaneously creating new opportunities and obligations for German rulers who now bore responsibility for governing territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to central Italy. The administrative structure established to govern the expanded imperial territories required careful coordination between German royal institutions and Italian governmental traditions that had evolved during the period of political fragmentation. Otto's solution involved the creation of a dual system in which German officials held ultimate authority, while Italian administrators retained responsibility for day-to-day governmental operations. The appointment of German margraves to control strategic frontier regions, like Verona and Friuli, ensured military security, while the preservation of Italian urban institutions maintained the commercial and administrative expertise necessary for effective territorial governance. This arrangement proved remarkably durable, providing the foundation for imperial administration in Italy throughout the medieval period. The Ottonian systems of ecclesiastical appointments represented one of the most innovative and controversial aspects of imperial governance in Italy. Otto's decision to appoint German bishops and abbots to major Italian sees reflected his understanding that effective political control required reliable administrators who possessed both the spiritual authority necessary to command popular respect and the personal loyalty that ensured implementation of imperial policies. The appointment of Bruno of Cologne as Archbishop of Milan in 965 AD exemplified this strategy, placing a member of the imperial family in control of northern Italy's most important ecclesiastical centre, while ensuring that church revenues would support imperial rather than local political objectives. This system of imperial ecclesiastical appointments created a network of German religious officials throughout Italy who served simultaneously as spiritual leaders and secular administrators. The Bishop of Würzburg's appointment to the See of Verona provided imperial control over a crucial Alpine communication route, while the installation of German abbots in major monasteries like Monte Cassino and San Salvatore ensured that monastic resources would support imperial policies rather than local aristocratic ambitions. These ecclesiastical officials possessed substantial temporal authority, including the right to maintain military forces and exercise judicial authority over their territorial domains, making them essential components of the imperial administrative system. The development of the Italian March system under Ottonian rule represented a sophisticated attempt to balance the requirements of frontier defence with the need for effective territorial administration. The creation of marches along the Byzantine frontier in southern Italy and the Slavic borders in the northeast provided secure defensive zones while establishing clear lines of authority for military operations and diplomatic relations with neighbouring powers. The March of Verona, controlling the crucial Alpine passes connecting Italy with Germany, became the most important of these administrative units, with its margrave serving as the emperor's primary representative for northern Italian affairs. The role of German ministeriales in Italian territorial governance reflected the Ottonian understanding that effective administration required a class of professional administrators who possessed specialized expertise while remaining dependent on imperial favour for their social and economic position. These unfree but highly educated officials, drawn primarily from German territories, served as judges, tax collectors, and military commanders throughout imperial Italy. Their legal status as imperial property prevented them from developing independent territorial ambitions, while their professional competence ensured effective implementation of imperial policies. The ministerial system proved particularly valuable in Italian urban centres, where complex commercial relationships and sophisticated legal traditions required administrators with specialised training and experience. The emergence of communal movements in northern Italian cities during the later 10th century represented the most significant challenge to imperial authority and foreshadowed the political developments that would transform Italy during the following centuries. Cities like Milan, Pavia and Cremona began developing autonomous governmental institutions that enabled them to pursue independent political and economic policies despite their theoretical subordination to imperial authority. The growth of merchant guilds and urban militias reflected the increasing political consciousness of commercial populations who possessed sufficient economic resources to challenge traditional aristocratic dominance while demanding greater participation in governmental decision-making. The communal movement's origins lay in the specific economic and social conditions that characterised northern Italian urban development during the 10th century. The revival of Mediterranean commerce following the decline of Muslim naval power had created substantial merchant populations whose wealth and political influence challenged traditional hierarchical relationships. Urban artisans and traders possessed economic interests that often conflicted with the agricultural priorities of territorial nobles, creating tensions that found expression in demands for autonomous urban governance. The development of communal institutions represented an attempt to resolve these conflicts through the creation of governmental systems that reflected urban rather than rural political priorities. Imperial responses to emerging communal movements revealed the fundamental tensions between centralized authority and local autonomy that would characterize German-Italian relations throughout the medieval period. Otto II's attempts to suppress urban independence through military force proved largely unsuccessful, as imperial armies lacked the resources necessary to maintain permanent garrisons in all major Italian cities, while simultaneously defending against Byzantine attacks in southern Italy and Slavic incursions along the eastern frontier. The emperor's defeat at the Battle of Stilo in 982 AD demonstrated the limitations of imperial military power when confronted with determined local resistance supported by external enemies. The regency of Theophanu following Otto II's premature death in 983 AD illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Ottonian governmental system. The Byzantine princess, serving as regent for her infant son Otto III, possessed sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean political relationships and maintained extensive diplomatic contacts throughout the Greek-speaking world. Her policies emphasized accommodation with Italian urban communities and Byzantine authorities rather than the aggressive expansion that had characterized earlier Ottonian rule. However, her foreign origins and gender created opposition among German nobles who viewed her regency as a threat to traditional Germanic political values and military traditions. The minority of Otto III and his subsequent attempt to establish a renovatio imperii centered on Rome represented the culmination of Ottonian imperial ambitions and simultaneously revealed the practical limitations of universal imperial authority in the medieval period. The young emperor's vision of renewed Roman imperial glory, inspired by classical texts and Byzantine ceremonial traditions, led him to establish his primary residence in Rome, while attempting to govern the entire empire from the ancient imperial capital. This policy reflected sophisticated understanding of the symbolic importance of Roman imperial traditions, while demonstrating naive comprehension of the practical requirements for effective territorial administration. The construction of Otto III's palace complex on the Aventine Hill represented a conscious attempt to revive classical imperial traditions while accommodating medieval governmental requirements. Archaeological investigations have revealed elaborate architectural elements that combined Byzantine decorative traditions with Germanic structural techniques, creating a unique synthesis that reflected the emperor's multicultural background and universal imperial ambitions. The palace's position overlooking the ancient forum deliberately evoked memories of classical imperial grandeur while its fortified character acknowledged the military realities of medieval urban politics. However, Otto III's Roman residence policy created serious problems for the administration of German territories that required continuous imperial attention to maintain political stability and military effectiveness. The emperor's prolonged absences from Germany enabled regional dukes to reassert autonomous authority while reducing imperial revenues that depended on direct royal supervision of taxation and military service obligations. The Saxon rebellion of 1002 AD demonstrated that even the imperial heartland could not be taken for granted when imperial attention focused primarily on Italian and Roman affairs rather than German political requirements. The development of imperial ideology during this period reflected sophisticated attempts to justify German rule over Italian territories through appeals to classical precedent and Christian theological principles. Imperial charters and diplomatic correspondence emphasized the continuity between the Holy Roman Empire and its classical predecessor, while presenting German emperors as the divinely appointed successors to Augustus and Constantine. This ideological framework provided important legitimacy for imperial authority over diverse populations who possessed different linguistic, cultural, and legal traditions, while maintaining theoretical unity through shared Christian faith and imperial allegiance. The practical implementation of imperial authority throughout Italy required constant negotiation between central governmental demands and local political realities that often conflicted with imperial objectives. The appointment of imperial representatives to major Italian cities created ongoing tensions with urban communities that increasingly demanded autonomous governance, while imperial military requirements conflicted with local economic priorities that emphasized commercial rather than military activities. These tensions would ultimately prove irreconcilable, leading to the prolonged conflicts between imperial authority and communal independence that would define Italian political development throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. The ecclesiastical reforms initiated during the later Ottonian period had created unintended consequences that would fundamentally transform the relationship between imperial and papal authority throughout the 11th century. By the 1070s, the movement to purify church institutions from secular corruption had evolved into a systematic challenge to the traditional imperial prerogatives that had governed ecclesiastical appointments since Charlemagne's reign. The appointment of Hildebrand as Pope Gregory VII in 1073 AD marked the beginning of the most sustained confrontation between temporal and spiritual authority in medieval European history, a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of Italy and establish new precedents for church-state relations throughout Christendom. Gregory VII's background as a Tuscan monk who had spent decades working within the papal administration provided him with intimate knowledge of both the corruption that plagued ecclesiastical institutions and the political mechanisms necessary to implement comprehensive reform. His service under previous popes had exposed him to the systematic sale of church offices, the widespread practice of clerical marriage, and the subordination of spiritual concerns to secular political calculations that characterized much of 11th century religious life. Unlike earlier reform-minded popes who had focused primarily on moral exhortation, Gregory approached ecclesiastical renewal as a comprehensive political project that required fundamental restructuring of the relationship between church and state throughout Western Europe. The Dictatus Papae, issued in 1075 AD, represented the most radical assertion of papal supremacy ever articulated by a medieval pontiff. This extraordinary document, comprising 27 propositions that defined papal authority, claimed for the Pope the exclusive right to depose emperors, transfer bishops, and release subjects from their oaths of allegiance to secular rulers. The 9th proposition, declaring that all princes should kiss the feet of the Pope alone, directly challenged the ceremonial protocols that had governed imperial-papal relations since the Ottonian period. The 27th and final proposition, stating that the Pope may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men, provided the theoretical justification for papal intervention in secular political disputes that would characterize Gregory's entire pontificate. The immediate catalyst for open confrontation between Gregory VII and Henry IV emerged from competing claims over the appointment of the Archbishop of Milan, a position that carried enormous political significance due to the city's strategic importance and substantial ecclesiastical revenues. The Milanese clergy had elected Atto as their archbishop following established canonical procedures, while Henry IV insisted on appointing Tedald, a candidate who possessed stronger connections to imperial political networks. This dispute represented far more than a disagreement over a single ecclesiastical appointment. It embodied the fundamental question of whether ultimate authority over church personnel belonged to the Pope as spiritual head of Christendom or to the Emperor as the divinely appointed ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Henry IV's response to papal demands for recognition of Atto's election revealed the Emperor's determination to maintain traditional imperial prerogatives despite growing ecclesiastical opposition. The Emperor's letter to Gregory, addressing him as Hildebrand, now no longer Pope but false monk, demonstrated both the personal animosity that characterized their relationship and the broader ideological conflict over the nature of imperial and papal authority. Henry's accusation that Gregory had climbed to the throne of Peter by fraud and violence reflected imperial propaganda designed to undermine papal legitimacy, while his threat to convene a council to depose the Pope indicated the Emperor's willingness to pursue the most extreme measures available to defend imperial rights. The papal response to Henry's defiance culminated in the dramatic excommunication decree issued on February 22, 1076 AD, which not only expelled the emperor from the Christian community but also released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance and prohibited them from serving him in any capacity. This unprecedented action represented the most direct papal challenge to imperial authority since the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, transforming a dispute over ecclesiastical appointments into a fundamental contest over the nature of political legitimacy in medieval Europe. The excommunication's practical consequences proved immediately apparent as German nobles who had previously supported Henry began questioning their continued allegiance to an emperor who had been declared anathema by the head of the Christian Church. The political crisis created by Henry's excommunication revealed the complex web of relationships that governed imperial politics in 11th century Germany. Saxon nobles, who had maintained uneasy relations with the Salian dynasty since Henry's father's suppression of their rebellion in the 1070s, seized upon the papal decree as justification for renewed opposition to imperial authority. The Dukes of Swabia and Bavaria, whose territorial ambitions had been constrained by imperial centralization policies, similarly viewed the excommunication as an opportunity to reassert regional autonomy against imperial control. The emergence of this noble coalition demonstrated that papal spiritual authority could provide powerful legitimacy for secular political opposition when combined with existing grievances against imperial rule. The Assembly of Triber in October 1076 AD represented the nadir of Henry IV's political fortunes and illustrated the practical consequences of papal excommunication for imperial authority. The gathering of German nobles, bishops and abbots at this strategic location on the Rhine created an alternative centre of political authority that challenged Henry's continued rule while demanding his submission to papal judgment. The Assembly's ultimatum, requiring Henry to obtain papal absolution within 1 year or face deposition, placed the emperor in an impossible position that threatened the complete collapse of Salian dynastic authority. The nobles' invitation to Gregory VII to preside over a council at Augsburg that would judge Henry's fitness to rule represented an unprecedented subordination of imperial authority to papal jurisdiction. Henry's decision to undertake the perilous winter journey across the Alps to seek papal absolution reflected both his desperate political situation and his sophisticated understanding of the ceremonial dimensions of medieval political authority. The emperor's departure from Speyer in December 1076 AD, accompanied by only a small retinue and travelling in disguise to avoid hostile forces, marked one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in medieval European history. The journey through snow-covered alpine passes during one of the harshest winters on record required extraordinary physical endurance, while the constant threat of capture by enemies who sought to prevent Henry from reaching Gregory added elements of genuine danger to the enterprise. The confrontation at Canossa Castle in January 1077 AD became one of the most symbolically significant events in medieval European history, though contemporary accounts differ regarding the specific details of Henry's submission to papal authority. The fortress, perched on a rocky outcrop in the Apennine foothills and belonging to Countess Matilda of Tuscany, provided Gregory with a secure location for receiving the emperor's petition, while its isolated position ensured that their meeting would occur away from the political pressures that might have influenced negotiations in more accessible locations. The castle's defensive strength also demonstrated Gregory's understanding that his personal safety required careful attention to security arrangements when dealing with an emperor whose political survival depended on obtaining papal absolution. Henry's three-day penance outside Canossa's gates, standing barefoot in the snow while wearing only a rough woolen shirt, created a powerful visual representation of imperial submission to papal authority that resonated throughout medieval Europe. Contemporary chroniclers described the emperor's appearance as deliberately designed to evoke maximum sympathy and demonstrate complete humility before papal judgment. The presence of Countess Matilda and Abbot Hugh of Cluny as intermediaries provided additional legitimacy for the proceedings, while their noble status ensured that witness accounts would carry credibility among aristocratic audiences throughout Europe. The ritual elements of Henry's penance, including his fasting and prayer vigils, emphasized the spiritual dimensions of his submission, while the public nature of his humiliation demonstrated the practical consequences of defying papal authority. Gregory's decision to grant Henry absolution on January 28, 1077 AD, reflected the Pope's recognition that prolonged imperial penance might generate sympathy for the emperor while undermining the moral authority of papal judgment. The formal ceremony of absolution, conducted within Canossa's chapel before an assembly of witnesses, followed established liturgical procedures while incorporating specific conditions that limited Henry's restored authority. The emperor's oath to submit all disputed matters to papal judgment and to implement ecclesiastical reforms throughout his territories represented significant concessions that acknowledged papal supremacy in spiritual affairs while constraining imperial autonomy in temporal matters that affected church interests. However, the political consequences of the Canossa encounter proved far more complex than either participant had anticipated. Henry's restoration to imperial dignity undermined the German noble coalition that had formed during his excommunication, as many aristocrats who had opposed him primarily due to papal condemnation now found themselves without religious justification for continued rebellion. The emperor's demonstration of submission to papal authority paradoxically strengthened his position among German populations, who viewed his willingness to undergo public penance as evidence of genuine Christian humility rather than political weakness. The dramatic nature of the Canossa encounter also generated widespread sympathy for Henry among secular rulers throughout Europe who recognized that papal claims to depose emperors pose potential threats to all forms of monarchical authority. Countess Matilda of Tuscany emerged from the Canossa encounter as one of the most influential political figures in 11th century Italy, her territories serving as the crucial bridge between papal, spiritual authority and military power necessary to enforce ecclesiastical reforms. Her inheritance of vast estates stretching from the Po Valley to the approaches of Rome provided her with agricultural revenues and strategic positions that made her cooperation essential for any pope seeking to challenge imperial authority in Italy. The Countess's decision to support Gregory VII against Henry IV reflected both her personal religious convictions and her sophisticated understanding of the political advantages the Papal Alliance offered for maintaining Tuscan autonomy against imperial centralization efforts. Matilda's military campaign throughout central Italy during the 1080s demonstrated the effectiveness of combining papal legitimacy with competent military leadership and substantial financial resources. Her forces, comprising both professional soldiers and militia units drawn from her extensive territories, proved capable of sustained operations against imperial armies while maintaining secure bases in strategically positioned fortresses throughout Tuscany. The Countess's victory at the Battle of Sorbara in 1084 AD, where her cavalry charges broke imperial formations and forced Henry IV to abandon his siege of Rome, established her reputation as one of the most formidable military commanders of her generation, while demonstrating that papal political objectives could be achieved through effective military action. The alliance between Matilda and successive popes created a powerful political combination that fundamentally altered the balance of power in central Italy throughout the later 11th century. The Countess's territories provided the papacy with secure refuges during periods of imperial pressure, while her military forces offered protection for papal political initiatives that might otherwise have been suppressed by imperial intervention. Her extensive patronage of monastic institutions and ecclesiastical construction projects demonstrated the material benefits that Papal Alliance could provide for regional rulers, while her diplomatic contacts throughout Europe facilitated papal communication with potential allies beyond the Alps. The resumption of hostilities between Henry IV and Gregory VII, following the Emperor's return to Germany, revealed that the Canossa encounter had resolved none of the fundamental issues that had created their original conflict. Henry's reassertion of imperial prerogatives over ecclesiastical appointments and his renewed support for anti-popes demonstrated his understanding that effective imperial authority required control over church personnel and resources. The Emperor's siege of Rome in 1084 AD and his installation of Clement III as Pope represented the most direct imperial challenge to papal independence since the Ottonian period, forcing Gregory into exile and threatening to reverse all the gains that the reform movement had achieved during the previous decade. Gregory VII's death in exile at Salerno in 1085 AD marked the end of the most confrontational phase of the investiture controversy, while establishing martyrdom narratives that would inspire subsequent papal resistance to imperial authority. His final words, reportedly declaring that he had loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile, became rallying cries for ecclesiastical reformers who viewed continued resistance to imperial control as essential for maintaining church independence. The Pope's burial in the Cathedral of Salerno, under the protection of Norman rulers who had supported papal political objectives, symbolized the international dimensions of the church-state conflict and the availability of alternative sources of military support for papal political initiatives. The election of Urban II as Pope in 1088 AD represented continuity with Gregorian reform objectives, while acknowledging the need for more pragmatic approaches to the imperial relationship. Urban's background as a French monk and his extensive experience in ecclesiastical administration provided him with sophisticated understanding of both reform ideology and practical political requirements for effective papal governance. His decision to avoid direct confrontation with Henry IV while maintaining essential reform principles demonstrated the evolution of papal strategy from the confrontational methods that had characterized Gregory's pontificate toward more subtle approaches that emphasized long-term institutional development over immediate political victories. The military campaigns that characterized the later phases of the investiture controversy revealed the extent to which ecclesiastical disputes had become integrated with broader patterns of territorial competition throughout northern and central Italy. Imperial forces operating in support of anti-popes found themselves confronting not only papal armies, but also the emerging communal militias of cities like Milan and Florence, whose commercial interests had become aligned with papal political objectives. The complexity of these military alliances demonstrated that the investiture controversy had evolved beyond a simple church-state dispute to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of political authority and territorial governance in medieval Italy. The role of Norman military power in southern Italy provided crucial support for papal political objectives while simultaneously creating new complications for ecclesiastical policy. The Norman conquest of Byzantine territories in Apulia and Calabria had eliminated imperial influence in southern Italy, while establishing powerful military allies who could threaten imperial positions in central Italy. However, Norman territorial ambitions also posed potential challenges to papal independence, as their rulers possessed sufficient military strength to dominate papal policy if their interests conflicted with ecclesiastical objectives. The complex relationship between papal spiritual authority and Norman military power illustrated the broader challenges facing medieval popes who required secular military support while maintaining claims to independence from temporal political control. The emergence of the First Crusade during Urban II's pontificate represented both the culmination of papal claims to universal spiritual authority and a sophisticated response to the political challenges created by the investiture controversy. The Pope's proclamation of the Crusade at Clermont in 1095 AD demonstrated papal ability to mobilize military resources throughout Western Europe for religious objectives, while providing alternative outlets for aristocratic military energies that might otherwise have been directed against papal political interests. The enthusiastic response to crusading appeals illustrated the extent to which papal spiritual authority had gained acceptance among European populations despite the ongoing conflicts with imperial power. The gradual evolution toward compromise solutions during the early 12th century reflected the exhaustion of both papal and imperial resources after decades of sustained conflict, while acknowledging the practical impossibility of achieving complete victory for either side. The reign of Henry V, who had deposed his own father in 1105 AD, created opportunities for renewed negotiations as the new emperor sought to establish legitimacy for his rule, while distancing himself from the most controversial aspects of his predecessor's ecclesiastical policies. Similarly, the election of Calixtus II as Pope in 1119 AD brought to the papal throne a member of the Burgundian nobility whose aristocratic background facilitated diplomatic contacts with imperial representatives, while his reform commitments ensured continuity with established papal objectives. The preliminary negotiations that preceded the Concordat of Worms revealed the sophisticated diplomatic methods that had evolved during decades of church-state conflict. Papal and imperial representatives conducted extensive discussions regarding the specific procedures for episcopal appointments, the division of temporal and spiritual authority, and the ceremonial protocols that would govern future imperial-papal relations. These negotiations required careful attention to symbolic details that might affect the broader political implications of any agreement while addressing practical concerns about the implementation of compromise arrangements throughout the diverse territories of the Holy Roman Empire. The Concordat of Worms, signed on September 23, 1122 AD, established the framework for church-state relations that would govern imperial-papal interactions throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The agreement's provisions regarding episcopal appointments created a complex procedure that acknowledged both papal spiritual authority and imperial temporal interests, while providing mechanisms for resolving future disputes through established diplomatic channels. The emperor's renunciation of investiture with ring and staff symbolically acknowledged papal supremacy in spiritual matters, while his retention of rights regarding temporal properties ensured continued imperial influence over ecclesiastical resources and personnel. The Concordat's geographical distinctions providing different procedures for appointments in Germany versus Italy and Burgundy, reflected sophisticated understanding of the diverse political conditions that characterized different regions of the empire, while establishing precedents for future negotiations between competing authorities. The resolution of the investiture controversy through the Concordat of Worms had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Italy, creating space for new forms of governance that would flourish in the power vacuum left by weakened imperial authority and reformed papal administration. While emperors and popes negotiated the boundaries of their respective spheres of influence, a revolutionary transformation was already underway in the coastal cities of the Italian peninsula. The maritime republics that emerged during this period would not only reshape Mediterranean commerce, but establish entirely new models of political organization that challenged traditional feudal hierarchies and created the foundation for Italy's distinctive urban civilization. Venice's emergence as the dominant maritime power in the Eastern Mediterranean represented the culmination of centuries of gradual political and economic development that had transformed a collection of refugee settlements in the Adriatic lagoons into Europe's most sophisticated commercial empire. The city's unique geographical position, protected by treacherous waters that discouraged land-based attacks while providing direct access to major sea routes, had enabled its inhabitants to develop specialized maritime skills and commercial expertise that proved invaluable as Mediterranean trade revived during the 11th century. The Venetian fleet that participated in the First Crusade comprised over 200 vessels of various sizes, from massive transport ships capable of carrying entire cavalry units to swift galleys designed for reconnaissance and rapid communication, demonstrating the Republic's extraordinary naval capabilities and organizational sophistication. The constitutional arrangements that governed Venetian political life represented one of the most innovative experiments in medieval European governance, creating institutions that balance competing interests while maintaining the stability necessary for long-term commercial planning. The office of Doge, theoretically elected for life by the assembled citizens, had evolved from Byzantine administrative origins into a uniquely Venetian institution that combined ceremonial dignity with practical limitations on executive power. The Doge's authority was constrained by an increasingly complex system of councils and committees that reflected the commercial oligarchy's determination to prevent any individual from accumulating sufficient power to threaten their collective interests. The Promission Ducale, a formal contract that each new Doge was required to sign upon election, specified detailed restrictions on ducal authority while establishing procedures for consultation with merchant assemblies on major policy decisions. The development of Venetian commercial law during this period created legal frameworks that would influence Mediterranean trading practices for centuries. The Venetian concept of collegianza, a form of commercial partnership that distributed risks and profits between investors and travelling merchants, provided the financial mechanisms necessary to support long-distance trade while protecting individual participants from catastrophic losses. These contracts, preserved in thousands of notarial documents from the 12th century, reveal a sophisticated understanding of commercial relationships that enabled Venetian merchants to operate successfully in markets stretching from Constantinople to Alexandria. The legal procedures for resolving commercial disputes, conducted by specialized tribunals composed of experienced merchants, created predictable business environments that encouraged investment in maritime ventures while establishing Venice's reputation for commercial reliability. The Crucible of 1082, granted by Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos in recognition of Venetian military assistance against Norman attacks on Byzantine territories, fundamentally altered the balance of commercial power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. This extraordinary privilege granted Venetian merchants complete exemption from customs duties throughout the Byzantine Empire, while providing them with exclusive trading quarters in Constantinople and other major Byzantine ports. The economic consequences of this arrangement proved transformative, enabling Venetian traders to undercut their competitors while accumulating the capital necessary to finance increasingly ambitious commercial ventures. Archaeological evidence from the Venetian Quarter in Constantinople reveals the scale of this commercial presence, with warehouses, churches, and residential compounds that house thousands of Venetian merchants and their families on a permanent basis. The expansion of Venetian commercial networks during the 12th century demonstrated the Republic's ability to adapt traditional trading relationships to new political circumstances created by the Crusades. Venetian merchants established permanent bases in Acre, Tyre, and other Crusader ports, creating commercial infrastructure that survived political changes and military conflicts while providing essential services to both Christian and Muslim traders. The famous Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, though primarily associated with German merchants, exemplified the sophisticated commercial facilities that the Republic developed to accommodate foreign traders while maintaining strict control over their activities. These institutions combined residential, storage, and financial services in carefully regulated environments that maximize commercial efficiency while ensuring Venetian oversight of all significant transactions. Genoa's rise as Venice's primary rival in Mediterranean commerce emerged from different geographical circumstances and political traditions that shaped distinctive approaches to maritime expansion and territorial organization. The Ligurian city's position on the northwestern Italian coast provided access to both Mediterranean sea routes and alpine passes connecting Italy with France and the Germanic lands, creating opportunities for commercial integration that Venice's isolated lagoon position could not match. Genoese merchants developed expertise in overland as well as maritime transportation, establishing trading networks that extended from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Morocco. The city's mountainous hinterland, while limiting agricultural production, provided timber resources essential for shipbuilding and metalworking industries that supported Genoese commercial expansion. The political structure that emerged in Genoa during the 11th and 12th centuries reflected the competitive nature of Ligurian society and the practical requirements of organizing complex commercial ventures. Unlike Venice's relatively stable constitutional arrangements, Genoese governance remained characterized by factional competition between powerful merchant families who formed temporary alliances for specific commercial or military objectives. The office of consul, typically held by multiple individuals simultaneously, provided executive authority while preventing any single faction from dominating municipal policy. This system, though often producing political instability, also encouraged innovation and risk-taking that enabled Genoese merchants to pursue aggressive expansion strategies that more cautious competitors might have avoided. The Genoese conquest of Corsica and Sardinia during the 11th century demonstrated the Republic's willingness to combine commercial objectives with territorial expansion in ways that distinguished it from Venice's primarily commercial approach to Mediterranean dominance. The military campaigns required to establish Genoese control over these strategic islands involved substantial investments in naval forces and fortification projects that transformed the Republic into a significant territorial power as well as a commercial empire. The administrative systems developed to govern these island possessions created precedents for later Genoese colonial expansion while providing secure bases for naval operations throughout the western Mediterranean. The competition between Genoa and Pisa for control of western Mediterranean trade routes produced some of the most significant naval conflicts of the medieval period, with battles that involved fleets numbering in the hundreds of vessels and determined the commercial destiny of entire regions. The Battle of Maloria in 1284, though occurring beyond the chronological scope of this chapter, represented the culmination of conflicts that had been building since the early 12th century, as both republics sought to establish exclusive control over Corsican and Sardinian territories. The earlier engagements that established the pattern of Genoese-Pisan rivalry revealed the sophisticated naval tactics and shipbuilding technologies that Italian maritime republics had developed to support their commercial ambitions. Pisan commercial expansion during the 11th and 12th centuries demonstrated the Republic's ability to compete successfully with both Genoa and Venice, despite its less advantageous geographical position on the Arno River, which required constant maintenance to prevent silting that could block access to the sea. The city's merchants compensated for these geographical limitations by developing specialized expertise in particular commercial sectors, particularly the transportation of pilgrims to the Holy Land and the importation of luxury goods from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. The famous Pisan colonies established in Constantinople, Acre, and other major commercial centres created permanent bases for Pisan merchants, while providing the Republic with reliable sources of commercial intelligence and diplomatic influence. The architectural monuments that Pisan merchants financed during this period of commercial prosperity, including the cathedral complex with its famous leaning tower, demonstrated the extraordinary wealth that Mediterranean commerce could generate while serving as visible symbols of the Republic's political and economic achievements. The cathedral's construction, beginning in 1063 AD with funds derived from successful military campaigns against Muslim Sicily, incorporated architectural elements and decorative materials from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating a unique synthesis that reflected Pisan commercial connections while asserting the Republic's cultural sophistication. The bronze doors cast by Bonanno Pisano, decorated with biblical scenes and contemporary historical events, exemplified the artistic achievements that commercial wealth made possible while serving practical functions in the urban, religious and political life of the Republic. Amalfi's role as the earliest of the Italian maritime republics provided crucial precedents for the commercial and legal innovations that would characterize Mediterranean trade throughout the medieval period. The city's strategic position on the Sorrentine Peninsula, with its natural harbour and defensible cliff-top location, had enabled its merchants to maintain commercial relationships with both Byzantine and Muslim territories during periods when other Italian cities were isolated by political conflicts. The Amalfitane Tables, a comprehensive maritime law code developed during the 11th century, established legal principles and commercial procedures that were adopted throughout the Mediterranean and influenced maritime law development for centuries. The commercial innovations pioneered by Amalfitane merchants included some of the earliest examples of sophisticated credit instruments and insurance arrangements that enabled long-distance trade to operate efficiently despite the risks inherent in medieval transportation and communication systems. Amalfitane contracts preserved in monastery archives reveal the development of complex financial instruments that distributed risks among multiple investors while providing mechanisms for transferring commercial obligations across vast distances. The Republic's merchants established some of the earliest permanent trading posts in North African and Middle Eastern ports, creating commercial infrastructure that survived political changes while providing essential services to traders from throughout the Mediterranean world. The decline of Amalfi's commercial dominance during the 12th century, primarily due to Norman conquest and the rise of more powerful maritime rivals, illustrated the challenges facing smaller commercial republics in an increasingly competitive Mediterranean environment. The city's incorporation into the Norman Kingdom of Sicily eliminated its political independence, while subjecting its merchants to taxation and regulation that undermined their competitive advantages. However, Amalfitane commercial expertise and legal traditions continued to influence Mediterranean trade practices long after the Republic's political eclipse, demonstrating the lasting significance of its contributions to medieval commercial development. The transformation of Italian urban centres into commercial hubs during this period required fundamental changes in social organisation, legal systems, and physical infrastructure that would reshape the character of medieval Italian civilization. The growth of merchant populations in cities like Milan, Florence, and Bologna created new social groups whose wealth and political influence challenged traditional aristocratic dominance while demanding institutional changes that reflected commercial rather than agricultural priorities. The emergence of merchant guilds provided organisational frameworks for coordinating commercial activities, while serving as vehicles for political participation that enabled urban commercial classes to influence municipal governance. The guild system that developed in Italian commercial centres during the 12th century created sophisticated mechanisms for regulating trade practices, maintaining quality standards, and resolving commercial disputes that proved essential for establishing the reputation for reliability that successful long-distance commerce required. The Arte di Lana in Florence, though reaching its full development in later centuries, had its origins in the wool trade relationships that Florentine merchants established during this period with English producers and Flemish manufacturers. These early commercial connections created the foundation for the textile industries that would make Florence one of medieval Europe's wealthiest cities, while demonstrating the potential for Italian urban centres to develop specialised commercial expertise. The physical transformation of Italian cities during this commercial revolution involved massive construction projects that created the infrastructure necessary to support expanded trade, while reflecting the growing wealth and political ambitions of merchant populations. The construction of new harbours, warehouses, and commercial facilities in maritime cities required substantial investments that demonstrated the profitability of Mediterranean commerce, while creating employment opportunities that attracted rural populations to urban centres. The development of new residential districts to accommodate growing merchant populations led to innovations in urban planning and architecture that would influence Italian city development throughout the medieval period. The social changes brought about by increased commercial wealth created new forms of cultural patronage and artistic expression that distinguished Italian urban civilization from the predominantly rural culture that characterized most of medieval Europe. Merchant families who had accumulated substantial fortunes through successful commercial ventures began commissioning architectural projects, artistic works, and literary productions that reflected their social aspirations, while contributing to the cultural achievements that would make medieval Italian cities renowned throughout Europe. The emergence of distinctive urban cultural traditions, combining commercial prosperity with intellectual sophistication, established patterns that would culminate in the Renaissance achievements of later centuries, while demonstrating the transformative power of commercial wealth in medieval society. The commercial prosperity that had transformed Italian maritime cities during the 11th and 12th centuries created ripple effects throughout the northern Italian plains, where inland urban centres began developing their own forms of autonomous governance that would fundamentally challenge imperial authority and reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The wealth generated by Mediterranean trade had not remained confined to coastal ports, but flowed inland through established commercial networks, enriching cities like Milan, Pavia, Cremona, and Brescia that served as crucial intermediaries between maritime commerce and the agricultural economies of the Po Valley. These inland commercial centres, swollen with merchant populations and artisan communities whose prosperity depended on trade rather than traditional agricultural relationships, began demanding political arrangements that reflected their economic importance while protecting their commercial interests from the arbitrary interference of imperial administrators and feudal lords. The commune system that emerged in northern Italian cities during the early 12th century represented a revolutionary form of political organisation that challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval governance and social hierarchy. Unlike the feudal arrangements that dominated most of Europe, where political authority descended through personal relationships between lords and vassals, the Italian communes created governmental institutions based on collective decision-making by urban populations who possessed sufficient economic independence to demand political participation. The earliest documented commune, established in Milan around 1097, emerged from a sworn association of prominent citizens who pledged mutual support in defending their commercial privileges against imperial interference, while assuming collective responsibility for municipal governance and military defence. The consular system that characterised early communal governance reflected both Roman legal traditions that had survived in Italian urban centres and practical adaptations to the specific requirements of governing complex commercial communities. The consuls, typically numbering between 6 and 12 individuals elected annually by assemblies of qualified citizens, exercised executive authority while remaining accountable to the broader urban community that had created their offices. These officials possessed judicial authority over commercial disputes, military command over urban militias, and diplomatic responsibility for negotiating with external authorities, creating a concentration of governmental functions that enabled rapid decision-making while maintaining collective oversight of municipal policy. The rotation of consular offices among different merchant families prevented the emergence of permanent ruling dynasties while ensuring that governmental experience remained distributed throughout the urban elite. The legal foundations of communal authority rested on sophisticated interpretations of Roman law that Italian jurists had preserved and adapted throughout the medieval period. The revival of legal studies at centres like Bologna provided intellectual frameworks for justifying urban autonomy while creating practical mechanisms for resolving the complex disputes that arose from commercial activities and urban governance. The concept of the universitas, borrowed from Roman corporation law, provided theoretical justification for treating urban communities as legal entities, capable of making binding agreements and exercising governmental authority independent of feudal relationships. This legal innovation enabled communes to negotiate treaties with external powers, levy taxes on their members, and maintain military forces without requiring approval from imperial or papal authorities. The economic foundations that supported communal independence derived from the fundamental transformation of northern Italian agriculture that had occurred during the 11th and 12th centuries. The development of more intensive agricultural techniques, including improved ploughing methods and crop rotation systems, had increased agricultural productivity while creating surplus populations that migrated to urban centres seeking commercial opportunities. The growth of rural markets and the monetization of agricultural relationships provided urban merchants with expanded opportunities for profitable investment, while creating interdependent economic networks that linked city and countryside in mutually beneficial relationships. The wealth generated by these economic activities provided communes with the financial resources necessary to maintain independent military forces and administrative systems while reducing their dependence on imperial support for essential governmental functions. The military organisation of communal forces reflected the distinctive social composition of Italian urban communities and their specific defensive requirements. The carroccio, a massive wheeled platform carrying the city's banner and altar, served as both a rallying point for municipal forces and a symbol of communal identity that inspired fierce loyalty among citizen soldiers. These elaborate constructions, drawn by oxen and accompanied by priests who conducted religious services during military campaigns, represented the fusion of civic pride and religious devotion that motivated communal military efforts. The Carroccio of Milan, decorated with elaborate metalwork and religious imagery, required a dedicated crew of attendants and guards who were responsible for its maintenance and protection during battle, demonstrating the substantial resources that communes devoted to these symbolic military installations. The composition of communal armies reflected the social diversity of northern Italian urban communities, while revealing the extent to which commercial prosperity had created new forms of military service that departed from traditional feudal obligations. Wealthy merchants provided heavy cavalry forces equipped with expensive armour and weapons that rivaled those of traditional feudal knights. while artisan communities supplied infantry units armed with crossbows, pikes, and other specialized weapons that proved highly effective in siege warfare and defensive operations. The urban militias that formed the core of communal forces underwent regular training exercises and maintained equipment stores that enabled rapid mobilization when external threats required collective military response. Archaeological excavations of communal armories have revealed sophisticated weapons and armor production facilities that supplied not only local military needs, but also export markets throughout northern Italy. The diplomatic relationships that communes established with each other during the 12th century created networks of mutual support that enabled smaller cities to resist imperial pressure while providing mechanisms for coordinating military and commercial policies across regional boundaries. The earliest intercommunal alliances, such as the agreement between Milan and Cremona in 1107, established precedents for collective action that would prove crucial when imperial forces threatened communal independence. These diplomatic arrangements included provisions for mutual military assistance, commercial cooperation, and coordinated resistance to external interference, creating the foundation for the more comprehensive league structures that would emerge during the confrontation with Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick the Barbarossa's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1152 brought to power a ruler whose vision of imperial authority directly challenged the autonomous governance that Italian communes had developed during the previous half-century. The new emperor's determination to restore effective imperial control over Italian territories reflected both his personal commitment to Hohenstaufen, dynastic traditions, and his practical understanding that imperial authority required substantial revenues that could only be extracted through direct control over Italy's prosperous urban centres. Frederick's legal advisors, trained in the revived Roman law traditions of Bologna, provided theoretical justifications for imperial supremacy that directly contradicted the legal arguments that communes used to defend their autonomous status, creating an ideological conflict that could not be resolved through diplomatic compromise. The Diet of Roncaglia in 1158 represented Frederick's most systematic attempt to reassert imperial authority over Italian communes through legal and administrative mechanisms that would subordinate municipal governance to imperial oversight. The assembly, attended by imperial officials, Italian bishops, and reluctant communal representatives, established comprehensive regulations that restricted communal autonomy while requiring substantial tribute payments to imperial authorities. The Roncaglia decrees prohibited communes from maintaining independent military forces, conducting autonomous diplomatic relations, or exercising judicial authority over major criminal cases, effectively reducing municipal governments to administrative agents of imperial authority. The appointment of imperial podesta to oversee communal governance represented a direct challenge to the consular system while ensuring that municipal policies would conform to imperial objectives rather than local commercial interests. The initial communal response to the Roncaglia decrees revealed the extent to which urban populations had developed political consciousness and organizational capabilities that enabled effective resistance to external authority. Milan's rejection of imperial demands and its subsequent destruction by Frederick's forces in 1162 demonstrated both the determination of communal resistance and the devastating consequences that imperial military power could inflict on rebellious cities. The systematic demolition of Milan's walls, the dispersal of its population, and the symbolic ploughing of its urban centre with salt represented imperial attempts to eliminate not only a specific centre of resistance, but the very concept of urban autonomy that challenged traditional hierarchical relationships. However, the destruction of Milan also revealed the limitations of imperial military strategies that depended on terror and devastation, rather than sustainable administrative control. The scattered Milanese population maintained their communal identity during their enforced exile while developing networks of support among other northern Italian cities that viewed Milan's fate as a warning of their own potential destruction. The refugees' accounts of imperial brutality strengthened anti-imperial sentiment throughout Lombardy, while providing practical intelligence about imperial military methods and weaknesses that would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts. The emperor's inability to establish effective administration over Milan's destroyed territories demonstrated that military conquest alone could not create the stable, governmental control that imperial authority required. The formation of the Lombard League in 1167 represented the culmination of diplomatic and military preparations that had been developing since Frederick's initial assertion of imperial authority over Italian communes. The alliance, initially comprising 16 cities including Venice, Verona, Padua and Vicenza, created unprecedented coordination between previously competitive urban centres that recognised their common interest in resisting imperial control. The League's organisational structure, based on collective decision-making and shared military obligations, reflected the governmental principles that individual communes had developed while adapting them to the requirements of intercommunal cooperation. The establishment of the new city of Alessandria, named in honour of Pope Alexander III, who supported the League against Frederick, demonstrated the alliance's ability to undertake major construction projects while creating strategic strongpoints that could anchor collective defensive efforts. The military preparations undertaken by the Lombard League revealed the sophisticated organisational capabilities that Italian communes had developed during decades of independent governance. The League's forces combined the individual military resources of member cities while creating integrated command structures that enabled coordinated operations across multiple theatres of conflict. The construction of new fortifications at strategic locations throughout Lombardy created defensive networks that could channel imperial forces into predetermined killing zones while providing secure bases for League military operations. The development of coordinated intelligence networks enabled League commanders to track imperial movements while maintaining secure communication between allied cities despite the distances and geographical obstacles that separated them. The financial arrangements that supported League military operations demonstrated the extraordinary wealth that northern Italian commerce had generated, while revealing the sophisticated fiscal mechanisms that communes had developed to fund collective enterprises. The assessment of contributions based on each city's commercial capacity, rather than traditional feudal obligations, reflected the economic realities of Italian urban development while ensuring that military burdens were distributed according to each member's ability to pay. The establishment of common treasuries and coordinated taxation systems enabled the League to maintain substantial military forces over extended periods while supporting the construction and maintenance of fortifications that required enormous investments in materials and labour. The tactical innovations that League forces developed during their confrontations with imperial armies reflected both the specific geographical conditions of northern Italian warfare and the distinctive military capabilities of urban populations. The extensive use of crossbow units, drawn from artisan communities that possessed the technical skills necessary to manufacture and maintain these sophisticated weapons, provided League forces with devastating firepower that proved highly effective against traditional heavy cavalry. The development of coordinated infantry formations, supported by field fortifications and mobile barriers, enabled communal forces to exploit their numerical advantages while minimizing the impact of imperial cavalry charges. The integration of siege engines and other mechanical devices, constructed by urban craftsmen who possessed specialized engineering knowledge, provided League forces with capabilities that had previously been available only to major feudal powers. The Battle of Legnano on May 29, 1176, represented the decisive military confrontation that established the practical limits of imperial authority in northern Italy, while demonstrating the effectiveness of communal military organisation and tactics. The engagement began when Frederick's cavalry forces, advancing through the morning mist toward what they believed to be a retreating enemy, encountered the prepared positions of the Lombard League army positioned near the Olona River. The imperial forces, comprising approximately 3,000 heavy cavalry and supporting infantry, initially achieved tactical surprise and drove back the League's forward positions, creating the impression that another imperial victory was imminent. However, the League's defensive preparations, including concealed crossbow positions and prepared obstacles, quickly disrupted the imperial advance while inflicting severe casualties on Frederick's mounted forces. The critical moment of the battle occurred when the imperial cavalry, having penetrated the League's initial defensive line, encountered the Carroccio of Milan positioned at the centre of the communal formation. The massive war wagon, surrounded by the most experienced fighters from the destroyed city, became the focal point for desperate combat as imperial forces attempted to capture this symbol of communal resistance, while League defenders fought with the fury of men defending not only their lives, but their political independence. The Emperor himself, unhorsed during the fierce fighting around the Carroccio, disappeared from the battlefield and was presumed dead by his followers, creating panic among imperial forces that had depended on his personal leadership for tactical coordination and strategic direction. The collapse of imperial resistance at Legnano resulted from a combination of tactical factors that revealed both the strengths of communal military organization and the limitations of traditional feudal warfare when confronted with determined urban resistance. The League's superior numbers, estimated at approximately 15,000 men compared to Frederick's smaller but more heavily equipped force, enabled them to absorb initial imperial attacks while maintaining reserves for counter-offensive operations. The coordination between different communal contingents, achieved through months of joint training and preparation, allowed League commanders to execute complex tactical maneuvers that maximize their advantages while exploiting imperial weaknesses. The psychological impact of fighting on familiar terrain for clearly understood political objectives provided League forces with morale advantages that proved decisive when the battle's outcome remained in doubt. Frederick's survival and eventual return to Germany after the Legnano defeat mark the beginning of a fundamental reassessment of imperial policy toward Italian communes that would ultimately lead to negotiated settlements, rather than continued military confrontation. The Emperor's recognition that military force alone could not establish sustainable control over Italian urban centres reflected his understanding that the economic and social changes that had occurred during the 12th century had created new forms of political organisation that required accommodation rather than suppression. The diplomatic contacts that began developing between imperial and League representatives during the months following Legnano revealed both sides' recognition that prolonged warfare served no one's interests, while creating opportunities for compromise arrangements that might satisfy essential requirements of both imperial authority and communal autonomy. The Peace of Constance, negotiated in 1183 after years of complex diplomatic discussions, established the legal framework that would govern imperial communal relations throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The treaty's provisions represented sophisticated compromises that acknowledged imperial sovereignty while protecting essential communal rights and privileges that had developed during the previous century. The Emperor's recognition of communal rights to elect their own magistrates, maintain autonomous military forces, and exercise judicial authority over most local matters represented significant concessions that effectively acknowledged the legitimacy of urban self-governance. The commune's acknowledgement of imperial sovereignty and their agreement to provide military service and tribute payments during imperial expeditions to Italy maintained theoretical imperial authority while limiting its practical exercise to specific circumstances and defined obligations. The transformation of communal governance that occurred during the late 12th and early 13th centuries reflected both the internal evolution of urban political institutions and the external pressures created by ongoing conflicts with imperial authority. The gradual replacement of consular systems with podesta governance represented attempts to address the factional conflicts and administrative inefficiencies that had developed as communes grew larger and more complex. The podesta system, which involved appointing experienced administrators from other cities to serve as chief executives for limited terms, provided professional expertise while reducing the influence of local factional disputes that had often paralysed consular decision-making processes. The evolution toward Podesta governance reflected the increasing professionalisation of urban administration that occurred as Italian communes developed more sophisticated governmental institutions. The Podesta, typically selected from among experienced administrators who had served successfully in other cities, brought specialised knowledge of legal procedures, military organisation, and diplomatic protocols that enabled more effective municipal governance. These professional administrators, serving fixed terms and prohibited from developing local political connections, could implement policies based on technical expertise rather than factional considerations, while maintaining accountability to the communal assemblies that had appointed them. The development of standardized administrative procedures and legal codes that accompanied Podesta governance created more predictable and efficient governmental operations, while establishing precedents that influenced urban political development throughout northern and central Italy. The social changes that accompanied the maturation of communal governance reflected the fundamental transformation of Italian urban society that had occurred during the 12th and 13th centuries. The emergence of distinct social groups within urban populations, including wealthy merchant families, prosperous artisans, and dependent labourers, created new forms of social stratification that differed significantly from traditional feudal hierarchies. The development of guild systems that regulated economic activities while providing mechanisms for political participation enabled different occupational groups to influence municipal policy while maintaining social order through established procedures for resolving conflicts and coordinating collective activities. The integration of rural populations into urban economic networks through commercial relationships and territorial expansion created larger and more diverse communities that required increasingly sophisticated governmental institutions to maintain effective administration and social cohesion. The coronation of Frederick II as Holy Roman Emperor in 1220 AD brought to power a ruler whose intellectual brilliance and administrative innovations would fundamentally transform the nature of imperial authority, while simultaneously creating the most sustained challenge to papal supremacy since the investiture controversy. Frederick's unique background as King of Sicily, with his multicultural upbringing in the cosmopolitan environment of Palermo, had exposed him to Byzantine administrative methods, Islamic governmental traditions, and Norman organizational techniques that would inform his revolutionary approach to imperial governance. His fluency in 6 languages, including Arabic and Greek, reflected an intellectual sophistication that distinguished him from his predecessors, while his deep knowledge of classical philosophy and natural sciences earned him the contemporary designation of Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. The kingdom of Sicily that Frederick inherited from his mother Constance represented the most advanced administrative state in medieval Europe, with governmental institutions that had evolved through successive Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic influences into a sophisticated bureaucratic system that would serve as the model for his imperial reforms. The Sicilian administrative apparatus, centred on the royal court at Palermo, employed professional civil servants recruited through merit-based examinations rather than feudal obligations, creating a class of educated administrators whose loyalty derived from royal patronage rather than hereditary relationships. The kingdom's financial system, based on comprehensive land surveys and standardized taxation procedures, generated revenues that far exceeded those available to other medieval rulers while supporting military forces and construction projects that demonstrated the practical advantages of centralized governmental control. Frederick's constitutions of Melfi, promulgated in 1231 AD, established the legal framework for what would become medieval Europe's most centralized monarchy, while creating precedents for royal authority that challenged traditional feudal relationships throughout the Holy Roman Empire. The comprehensive law code, comprising 253 individual statutes, regulated every aspect of governmental administration from judicial procedures to commercial regulations, creating uniform legal standards that replaced the patchwork of local customs and privileges that had characterized earlier medieval governance. The Constitution's provisions regarding royal monopolies over salt production, silk manufacturing and grain exportation demonstrated Frederick's understanding that effective political control required direct governmental supervision of essential economic activities rather than dependence on feudal obligations and voluntary contributions. The administrative innovations implemented in the Kingdom of Sicily revealed Frederick's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between governmental efficiency and political authority. The establishment of regional administrative centres, each supervised by royal officials responsible directly to the Crown, created chains of command that enabled rapid communication and coordinated policy implementation throughout the kingdom's diverse territories. The appointment of justiciars with comprehensive judicial and administrative authority eliminated the jurisdictional conflicts that had plagued earlier governmental systems, while ensuring that royal law took precedence over local customs and privileges. The creation of a professional diplomatic service, staffed by multilingual administrators trained in law and rhetoric, enabled Frederick to conduct complex negotiations with Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European powers while maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks that provided crucial information about political developments throughout the Mediterranean world. The cultural synthesis that characterized Frederick's court at Palermo reflected both his personal intellectual interests and his strategic recognition that cultural achievements could enhance political prestige while attracting talented administrators and scholars whose expertise would strengthen royal governance. The court's library, containing works in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew, represented one of medieval Europe's most comprehensive collections of classical and contemporary scholarship, while the translation project sponsored by royal patronage made previously inaccessible texts available to Western European scholars. The scientific investigations conducted under royal auspices, including Frederick's own treatise on falconry that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of animal behaviour and natural philosophy, established the Sicilian court as a centre of intellectual innovation that rivaled the great universities of Paris and Bologna. Frederick's approach to the papacy represented a fundamental departure from the accommodating policies that had characterised imperial-papal relations since the Concordat of Worms, reflecting his conviction that effective imperial authority required direct control over ecclesiastical resources and personnel throughout his territories. His appointment of trusted administrators to major ecclesiastical positions, regardless of papal preferences, demonstrated his determination to subordinate church hierarchy to imperial political objectives, while his taxation of ecclesiastical properties violated established agreements that had exempted church lands from royal financial demands. The emperor's establishment of the University of Naples in 1224 AD, designed to train administrators for royal service while providing an alternative to papal-controlled educational institutions, represented a direct challenge to ecclesiastical monopoly over higher education that threatened to undermine one of the Church's primary sources of political influence. The confrontation between Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX that erupted in the late 1220s emerged from competing visions of Christian governance that could not be reconciled through diplomatic compromise or territorial accommodation. Gregory's background as a canon lawyer and his deep commitment to Gregorian reform principles made him particularly sensitive to imperial encroachments on ecclesiastical authority, while his experience as papal legate had provided him with detailed knowledge of the administrative methods that Frederick employed to subordinate church institutions to royal control. The Pope's decision to launch a comprehensive campaign against imperial authority reflected his understanding that Frederick's governmental innovations posed existential threats to papal independence that required immediate and decisive response. The emperor's delayed departure for the Sixth Crusade provided Gregory IX with the pretext necessary to initiate formal proceedings against imperial authority, while rallying ecclesiastical opposition to Frederick's policies throughout Western Europe. The papal excommunication pronounced in 1227 AD, ostensibly for Frederick's failure to fulfill his crusading vows, actually represented Gregory's response to years of imperial interference in ecclesiastical affairs that had violated fundamental principles of church independence. The excommunication's practical consequences proved immediately apparent as bishops throughout the Holy Roman Empire faced impossible choices between obedience to papal authority and continued cooperation with imperial administration, creating ecclesiastical chaos that undermined governmental effectiveness, while providing papal supporters with opportunities to organise resistance to imperial policies. Frederick's decision to proceed with the crusade despite his excommunicated status represented both a calculated political manoeuvre and a demonstration of his conviction that imperial authority derived from divine appointment rather than papal approval. The emperor's departure for the Holy Land in June 1228 AD, accompanied by a modest military force but extensive diplomatic preparations, reflected his understanding that successful crusading required negotiation rather than military conquest in the complex political environment of 13th century Palestine. His multilingual capabilities and sophisticated knowledge of Islamic culture, acquired during his Sicilian upbringing, provided crucial advantages in the diplomatic contacts that would ultimately prove more significant than military operations in achieving crusading objectives. The negotiations that Frederick conducted with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt revealed both rulers' sophisticated understanding of the political complexities that governed Christian-Muslim relations in the Eastern Mediterranean during the 13th century. The Sultan's willingness to cede Jerusalem to Christian control in exchange for imperial guarantees regarding Muslim pilgrimage rights reflected his recognition that diplomatic accommodation served both rulers' interests more effectively than continued military confrontation. Frederick's acceptance of arrangements that permitted continued Muslim presence in Jerusalem while establishing Christian administrative control demonstrated his pragmatic approach to religious conflicts that contrasted sharply with the militant rhetoric that characterized most crusading enterprises. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in February 1229 AD, achieved the primary objective of Christian crusading through negotiated settlement rather than military conquest, establishing precedents for diplomatic resolution of religious conflicts that would influence subsequent Christian-Muslim relations throughout the medieval period. The imperial coronation that Frederick conducted in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on March 18, 1229 AD, represented an unprecedented assertion of imperial authority that directly challenged papal claims to supremacy over Christian rulers. The ceremony, conducted without ecclesiastical participation due to Frederick's excommunicated status, involved the emperor placing the crown of Jerusalem upon his own head while proclaiming his divine appointment as protector of Christian interests in the Holy Land. Contemporary accounts describe the elaborate ritual elements that Frederick employed to legitimize his self-coronation, including readings from imperial legal codes and invocations of classical precedents that emphasized imperial rather than papal authority over temporal governance. The coronation's symbolic significance extended far beyond its immediate political consequences, establishing precedents for royal independence from ecclesiastical approval that would influence subsequent developments in church-state relations throughout Western Europe. The papal response to Frederick's successful crusade and self-coronation revealed the extent to which Gregory IX viewed the emperor's achievements as threats to papal authority rather than contributions to Christian welfare. The Pope's condemnation of the Jerusalem settlement, despite its restoration of Christian control over Christianity's holiest sites, demonstrated his conviction that imperial success achieved without papal approval undermined ecclesiastical supremacy, more than military failure would have damaged Christian interests. Gregory's organisation of military campaigns against imperial territories in southern Italy, while Frederick remained in the Holy Land, represented the most direct papal challenge to imperial authority since the investiture controversy, transforming religious conflicts into territorial warfare that would devastate Italian communities throughout the 1230s. The military campaigns that characterised the renewed imperial-papal conflict revealed both the sophisticated military technologies that had developed during the early 13th century and the devastating consequences of prolonged warfare for Italia. Italian urban and rural populations. Frederick's forces, returning from the successful crusade with enhanced prestige and military experience, employed siege engines and fortification techniques that reflected both classical engineering principles and contemporary innovations developed through contact with Byzantine and Islamic military traditions. The imperial army's systematic reduction of papal strongholds throughout the papal states demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated siege operations supported by comprehensive logistical planning, while the destruction of urban centres and agricultural infrastructure illustrated the brutal realities of medieval warfare when conducted without restraint by competing authorities. The Battle of Cortenuova in November 1237 AD represented the decisive military engagement that established Frederick's dominance over the revived Lombard League, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of imperial military organisation against communal forces. The engagement began when Frederick's army, advancing through the Po Valley toward Milan, encountered League forces positioned near the Oglio River in a defensive formation designed to exploit the marshy terrain that limited cavalry manoeuvres. The imperial forces, comprising approximately 15,000 men including German heavy cavalry, Sicilian infantry and Saracen archers, initially faced tactical disadvantages due to the unfavourable terrain and the League's superior numbers. However, Frederick's tactical innovations, including the coordinated use of crossbow units and mobile field fortifications, gradually disrupted the League's defensive positions, while inflicting severe casualties on communal forces. The capture of the Milanese Carroccio during the Cortenuova battle provided Frederick with both practical military advantages and enormous symbolic prestige that enhanced imperial authority throughout northern Italy. The massive war wagon, defended by the most experienced fighters from Milan and other League cities, had served as the focal point for communal resistance until imperial forces succeeded in overwhelming its defenders through sustained assaults supported by siege engines. Frederick's decision to transport the captured Carroccio to Rome as a gift for the Roman people represented a calculated political gesture designed to demonstrate imperial victory while appealing to Roman civic pride that had often conflicted with papal political objectives. The triumphal procession that accompanied the Carroccio's arrival in Rome, complete with captured League standards and prominent prisoners, evoked memories of classical imperial celebrations while asserting Frederick's claims to legitimate succession from ancient Roman emperors. The administrative reforms that Frederick implemented throughout northern Italy following his military victories revealed his determination to create uniform governmental systems that would eliminate the autonomous institutions that had enabled communal resistance to imperial authority. The appointment of imperial podesta to replace elected, communal officials represented a systematic attempt to subordinate urban governance to imperial oversight while maintaining the administrative expertise that had made Italian cities prosperous and efficient. The standardization of legal procedures, taxation systems, and commercial regulations created predictable governmental environments that facilitated economic activity, while ensuring that municipal resources would support imperial rather than local political objectives. The establishment of imperial courts with jurisdiction over major criminal and commercial cases eliminated the judicial autonomy that had been fundamental to communal independence, while creating appeals procedures that ultimately led to imperial rather than papal authority. The cultural policies that Frederick pursued during the height of his power reflected both his personal intellectual interests and his strategic understanding that cultural achievements could legitimize imperial authority while attracting talented individuals whose expertise would strengthen governmental administration. The poetic compositions produced at the imperial court, written in vernacular Italian rather than Latin, represented some of the earliest examples of sophisticated literary expression in the Italian language, while demonstrating the emperor's commitment to cultural innovation that transcended traditional linguistic boundaries. The scientific investigations sponsored by imperial patronage, including astronomical observations and medical research, established precedents for governmental support of intellectual inquiry that would influence subsequent developments in European scholarship while providing practical knowledge that enhanced administrative effectiveness. The architectural projects undertaken during Frederick's reign demonstrated both the enormous resources that his governmental innovations had generated and his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between monumental construction and political prestige. The construction of Castel del Monte in Apulia, with its unique octagonal design and elaborate mathematical proportions, reflected Frederick's knowledge of classical architectural principles while incorporating defensive features that acknowledged the military realities of 13th century warfare. The castle's innovative design, combining residential comfort with military functionality, created architectural synthesis that influenced subsequent castle construction throughout Europe while serving as a visible symbol of imperial power that demonstrated Frederick's ability to undertake massive construction projects despite ongoing military conflicts. The emergence of the Guelph and Ghibelline factional system during Frederick's reign represented the institutionalization of political divisions that would dominate Italian urban politics for the remainder of the medieval period. The terms, derived from the German names Welf and Weiblingen associated with competing imperial dynasties, evolved into comprehensive ideological frameworks that encompass not only attitudes toward imperial and papal authority, but also positions on commercial policy, social organization, and cultural development. Cities that adopted Guelph identifications typically supported papal political objectives while favoring commercial expansion and urban autonomy, whereas Ghibelline communities generally endorsed imperial authority while emphasizing territorial consolidation and hierarchical social organization. The factional conflicts that erupted throughout northern and central Italy during the 1240s revealed the extent to which Frederick's policies had polarized Italian political opinion, while creating opportunities for local rivals to pursue their conflicts within broader ideological frameworks. The warfare between Guelph and Ghibelline cities involved not only military confrontations, but also economic boycotts, diplomatic isolation, and cultural competitions that affected every aspect of Italian urban life. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the construction of elaborate fortifications and the destruction of commercial infrastructure that demonstrated both the intensity of factional conflicts and their devastating consequences for Italian economic development. The factional system's persistence throughout subsequent centuries indicated that Frederick's reign had created political divisions that transcended immediate imperial-papal conflicts while establishing enduring patterns of Italian political competition. The death of Pope Gregory IX in August 1241 AD created opportunities for diplomatic resolution of the imperial-papal conflict that had devastated Italy throughout the previous decade, though the deep ideological divisions that had developed during years of warfare made comprehensive reconciliation extremely difficult to achieve. Frederick's siege of Rome during the papal interregnum demonstrated his determination to influence papal elections, while his subsequent negotiations with the newly elected Pope Innocent IV revealed both rulers' recognition that continued warfare served neither imperial nor ecclesiastical interests. However, the fundamental disagreements regarding the nature of imperial and papal authority that had created the original conflict remained unresolved, ensuring that any diplomatic settlement would prove temporary unless accompanied by structural changes in the relationship between temporal and spiritual power. Pope Innocent IV's flight to Lyon in 1244 AD represented the most dramatic papal challenge to imperial authority since Gregory VII's confrontation with Henry IV, though the circumstances and consequences of 13th century papal exile differed significantly from earlier examples of church-state conflict. Innocent's establishment of an alternative papal court beyond Frederick's reach enabled continued ecclesiastical opposition to imperial policies while providing a secure base for organising international resistance to imperial authority. The Pope's legal training and administrative experience provided him with sophisticated understanding of the canonical and diplomatic procedures necessary to mobilise European opposition to Frederick's governmental innovations, while his French connections offered potential military support for anti-imperial campaigns. The Council of Lyon, convened by Innocent IV in 1245 AD, represented the culmination of papal efforts to organise comprehensive opposition to Frederick's imperial authority, while establishing legal precedents for papal supremacy over temporal rulers that would influence church-state relations throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The Council's formal deposition of Frederick, proclaimed before an assembly of ecclesiastical and secular representatives from throughout Western Europe, asserted papal authority to judge and remove emperors who violated their obligations to protect church interests. The elaborate legal arguments presented to justify imperial deposition drew upon both canonical law and classical precedents, while creating new theoretical frameworks for papal intervention in temporal governance that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Frederick's case. The military campaigns that followed Frederick's deposition revealed both the continued effectiveness of imperial military organisation and the growing strength of papal-sponsored opposition that drew support from throughout Western Europe. The emperor's forces, despite their tactical superiority and professional leadership, faced increasing difficulties in maintaining control over territories where local populations had been influenced by papal propaganda and ecclesiastical sanctions. The emergence of papal-sponsored military expeditions, led by experienced commanders and supported by substantial financial resources, created multiple theatres of conflict that stretched imperial military capabilities while providing opportunities for anti-imperial forces to coordinate their resistance efforts. The prolonged nature of these conflicts demonstrated that neither side possessed the overwhelming advantages necessary for decisive victory, ensuring that warfare would continue until political circumstances changed or one side's resources became exhausted. The death of Frederick II at Castel Fiorentino in December 1250 AD marked the end of the most sustained challenge to papal supremacy in medieval European history, while creating succession problems that would ultimately lead to the complete collapse of Hohenstaufen dynastic authority. The emperor's final years had been marked by increasing isolation as European rulers, influenced by papal propaganda and concerned about the implications of imperial success for their own authority, gradually withdrew their support for imperial policies. Frederick's attempts to ensure dynastic succession through careful arrangements for his son Conrad's inheritance proved inadequate to address the fundamental problems that imperial policies had created, particularly the irreconcilable opposition of ecclesiastical authorities who viewed Hohenstaufen rule as an existential threat to church independence. The brief reign of Conrad IV as Holy Roman Emperor revealed the extent to which Frederick's policies had undermined the traditional sources of imperial authority, while creating enemies whose opposition could not be overcome through military force or diplomatic accommodation. Conrad's attempts to maintain control over his father's Italian territories faced coordinated opposition from papal forces, Guelph cities, and foreign interventions that exploited Hohenstaufen weaknesses while pursuing their own territorial ambitions. The young emperor's death in 1254 AD eliminated the last legitimate Hohenstaufen claimant with sufficient political experience to maintain dynastic authority, creating a succession crisis that would enable papal supporters to complete their destruction of imperial power in southern Italy. The tragic fate of Conradin, the last legitimate Hohenstaufen heir, represented the final chapter in the papal campaign to eliminate imperial authority that had challenged ecclesiastical supremacy throughout the 13th century. The young prince's invasion of Italy in 1267 AD, supported by Ghibelline cities and German nobles who sought to restore imperial authority, initially achieved significant military successes that suggested the possibility of Hohenstaufen restoration. However, his defeat at the Battle of Tagliacozzo in August 1268 AD by Charles of Anjou's forces, fighting under papal sponsorship, eliminated the last hope for imperial revival while providing papal authorities with the opportunity to execute the final Hohenstaufen claimant. Conradin's public execution in Naples represented both the practical elimination of dynastic opposition to papal policies and the symbolic triumph of ecclesiastical authority over the imperial tradition that had dominated European politics since Charlemagne's reign. The papal victory over the Hohenstaufen dynasty fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout Italy, while creating new political arrangements that would characterize the peninsula's development throughout the later medieval period. The elimination of effective imperial authority enabled the emergence of independent city-states, territorial principalities, and foreign interventions that would fragment Italian political unity while creating the competitive environment that would ultimately produce the Renaissance achievements of the 14th and 15th centuries. The papacy's success in destroying imperial opposition had demonstrated the effectiveness of sustained ecclesiastical resistance to temporal authority, though the methods employed in achieving this victory had also revealed the extent to which spiritual institutions had become involved in purely political conflicts that compromised their religious mission and moral authority. The execution of Conradin in Naples had eliminated the last vestige of Hohenstaufen imperial authority, but the papal victory that seemed so complete in 1268 AD would prove Pyrrhic within decades. The very success of ecclesiastical resistance to imperial power had created a political vacuum throughout northern and central Italy that would be filled not by strengthened papal governance, but by ambitious local strongmen whose rise would fundamentally transform the Italian political landscape. The communal institutions that had developed during the 12th and 13th centuries, weakened by decades of factional warfare between Guelph and Ghibelline supporters, proved increasingly incapable of maintaining effective governance as economic pressures, social tensions, and external military threats overwhelmed the consensus-based decision-making that had characterized earlier urban republics. The transformation of communal governments into signori represented one of the most significant political developments in medieval European history, as Italian cities gradually abandoned their experimental republican institutions in favor of autocratic rule by individual strongmen or powerful families. This transition occurred not through dramatic coups or foreign conquest, but through the gradual concentration of emergency powers in the hands of individuals who possessed the military resources and administrative expertise necessary to address the crises that overwhelmed traditional communal governance. The appointment of permanent podesta with expanded authority, initially intended as temporary measures to address specific emergencies, evolved into hereditary lordships that maintained the forms of communal government while concentrating actual power in dynastic hands. The Visconti family's rise to dominance in Milan exemplified the sophisticated methods through which ambitious families transformed temporary military commands into permanent territorial lordships. Ottone Visconti's appointment as Archbishop of Milan in 1262 AD provided him with both spiritual authority and substantial temporal resources that enabled him to organize effective resistance to the Torriani family, who had dominated Milanese politics during the preceding decades. The Visconti's systematic accumulation of ecclesiastical benefices, strategic marriage alliances, and military commands created a power base that transcended traditional communal institutions while maintaining sufficient legitimacy to avoid provoking widespread popular opposition. Ottone's nephew Matteo Visconti's appointment as imperial vicar in 1294 AD formalised the family's control over Milan while providing legal justification for their exercise of autocratic authority that bypassed communal assemblies and traditional consultation procedures. The administrative innovations implemented by the Visconti during their consolidation of power revealed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between effective governance and political legitimacy in late medieval urban environments. The family's retention of traditional communal offices and ceremonial procedures maintained the appearance of republican government while concentrating actual decision-making authority in their private councils and administrative apparatus. The appointment of professional administrators drawn from throughout northern Italy created a bureaucratic system that combined the efficiency of centralized authority with the expertise of experienced urban governance, enabling the Visconti to provide more effective administration than the factionally divided communal governments they had replaced. The development of comprehensive taxation systems, professional military forces, and coordinated diplomatic policies demonstrated the practical advantages of autocratic rule, while justifying continued Visconti dominance through demonstrated governmental competence. The territorial expansion that characterized Visconti rule throughout the 14th century illustrated both the military capabilities that seigneurial governments could develop and the persistent instability that marked Italian political relationships during this period. Gian Galeazzo Visconti's systematic conquest of neighbouring cities during the 1380s and 1390s created the most extensive territorial state in northern Italy since the Lombard Kingdom, with Visconti authority extending from the Alpine foothills to the approaches of Bologna and Florence. The Duke's military campaigns employed professional mercenary companies, whose tactical innovations and sustained availability provided decisive advantages over the citizen militias and temporary alliances that characterized traditional communal defense. The siege of Padua in 1388 AD demonstrated the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Visconti forces had developed, with elaborate siege works and coordinated artillery bombardments that overcame fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable. The Scaligeri family's control over Verona and the eastern Veneto represented a different model of seigneurial development, based on the systematic exploitation of the city's strategic position, controlling alpine trade routes, and its agricultural hinterland's exceptional productivity. Mastino I della Scala's rise to power during the early 13th century had emerged from his family's traditional role as leaders of the Ghibelline faction in Verona's factional conflicts, but his successors transformed this partisan leadership into comprehensive territorial authority that extended throughout the Veneto and into Lombardy. The Scaligeri court at Verona became renowned throughout Europe for its cultural patronage and architectural achievements, with the family's elaborate tomb monuments and palace complexes demonstrating both their enormous wealth and their sophisticated understanding of the relationship between artistic patronage and political prestige. Can Grande, the Della Scala's military campaigns during the early 14th century, reveal the extent to which seigneurial rulers could mobilize resources for sustained territorial expansion, while maintaining the internal stability necessary for continued economic prosperity. His conquest of Vicenza, Padua and Treviso created a regional state that controlled much of northeastern Italy, while his diplomatic relationships with other seigneurial families established networks of mutual support that provided security against external threats. The Scaligeri military organization combined traditional feudal levies with professional mercenary companies and innovative siege technologies that enabled them to conduct successful campaigns against both communal forces and rival seigneurial armies. Archaeological evidence from Scaligeri fortifications reveals sophisticated defensive architecture that incorporated both traditional medieval castle design and innovative artillery-resistant features that reflected the changing nature of 14th century warfare. The Este family's dominance over Ferrara and the surrounding Po Delta region demonstrated how seigneurial rulers could exploit specific geographical advantages and economic opportunities to create stable territorial states despite limited initial resources. The family's control over crucial river transportation routes connecting northern Italy with the Adriatic Sea provided them with substantial commercial revenues that supported military forces and administrative systems capable of resisting external pressure while maintaining internal order. Obizzo II d'Este's consolidation of authority during the late 13th century had required careful navigation of the complex factional conflicts that characterized Ferrare's politics, but his successors transformed this local dominance into regional influence that extended throughout the eastern Po Valley and into the Romagna. The cultural achievements of the Estese court during the 14th century illustrated the extent to which seigneurial patronage could foster artistic and intellectual development that rivaled the accomplishments of much larger and wealthier states. The family's support for poets, scholars and artists created a cultural environment that attracted talent from throughout Italy, while producing literary and artistic works that enhanced the dynasty's prestige throughout Europe. The construction of the Este castle in Ferrara, with its innovative architectural features and elaborate decorative programs, demonstrated both the family's wealth and their sophisticated understanding of the relationship between monumental architecture and political authority. The court's library and scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts and scholarly works that preserved classical texts while fostering new developments in vernacular literature and historical writing. The Papal States struggle to maintain temporal authority during this period of seigneurial expansion reveal the fundamental contradictions between spiritual mission and territorial governance that had plagued papal administration since the investiture controversy. The papacy's victory over imperial authority had eliminated external challenges to ecclesiastical independence, but it had also created responsibilities for governing extensive territories whose diverse populations possessed conflicting interests and political traditions. The Avignon papacy, beginning with Clement V's relocation to France in 1309 AD, represented both a response to the political pressures that made residence in Rome impossible and an acknowledgement that effective papal governance required accommodation with secular authorities who possessed the military resources necessary for territorial administration. The administrative challenges that confronted papal government during the Avignon period reflected the broader difficulties facing ecclesiastical authorities who attempted to exercise temporal power without compromising their spiritual mission. The appointment of French cardinals and administrators to govern Italian papal territories created resentment among Italian populations who viewed these appointments as foreign occupation rather than legitimate ecclesiastical authority. The taxation systems implemented to support the expanded papal court at Avignon required increasingly aggressive collection methods that conflicted with traditional expectations regarding ecclesiastical benevolence, while generating revenues that supported luxury and political activities that scandalized contemporary observers throughout Europe. The military campaigns that papal forces conducted throughout the Papal States during the 14th century demonstrated both the resources that ecclesiastical authorities could mobilize for temporal objectives and the limitations of spiritual authority when confronted with determined secular opposition. Cardinal Albornoz' systematic reconquest of papal territories during the 1350s and 1360s employed professional mercenary companies and sophisticated military strategies that proved effective against local strongmen and rebellious communes. But these successes required methods and expenditures that raised fundamental questions about the compatibility of spiritual leadership with territorial conquest. the construction of elaborate fortifications throughout the Papal States, including the massive fortress at Spoleto and the reconstructed walls of numerous cities, provided security for papal administration while creating visible symbols of ecclesiastical temporal power that impressed contemporary observers, but also attracted criticism from reform-minded clergy who questioned the appropriateness of such military expenditures. The Great Western Schism that erupted in 1378 AD represented the culmination of the political and administrative problems that had been developing within ecclesiastical governance throughout the 14th century. The election of competing popes at Rome and Avignon created a crisis of authority that extended far beyond ecclesiastical administration to affect political relationships throughout Europe as secular rulers were forced to choose between rival claimants to papal authority. The schism's impact on Italian political development proved particularly significant, as the competing papal court sought support from different seigneurial families and communal governments, creating new opportunities for territorial expansion and political manoeuvring that further fragmented Italian political unity. The military conflicts that accompanied the Great Schism revealed the extent to which spiritual authority had become subordinated to political calculations, as competing papal courts employed mercenary armies and diplomatic alliances to advance their territorial claims. The siege of Rome by forces supporting the Avignon papacy in 1379 AD involved elaborate military operations that differed little from contemporary secular warfare, with both sides employing professional soldiers and sophisticated siege technologies to achieve political objectives. The devastation inflicted on Italian territories during these ecclesiastical conflicts demonstrated that spiritual authority provided no protection against the brutal realities of medieval warfare when competing religious authorities pursued their disputes through military means. Venice's territorial expansion during this period represented the most successful example of republican institutions adapting to the challenges of governing extensive mainland territories while maintaining the commercial focus that had created the Republic's prosperity. The Venetian conquest of Padua in 1405 AD marked the beginning of systematic terra firma expansion that would transform the Maritime Republic into one of Italy's most powerful territorial states. The administrative systems developed to govern these mainland acquisitions combined traditional Venetian commercial expertise with innovative approaches to territorial administration that preserved local autonomy while ensuring Venetian political control. The appointment of Venetian nobles as governors of subject cities created career opportunities for the Republic's aristocracy, while providing experienced administration that maintained order and prosperity throughout the expanded Venetian state. The military innovations that enabled Venetian territorial expansion reflected both the Republic's substantial financial resources and its sophisticated understanding of contemporary warfare. The development of professional military forces, including both traditional galley fleets and innovative artillery units, provided Venice with capabilities that exceeded those of most seigneurial states, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for operations in diverse geographical environments. The siege of Padua demonstrated Venetian mastery of contemporary military technology, with coordinated artillery bombardments and systematic siege works that overcame fortifications that had previously resisted much larger armies. The integration of mainland military resources with traditional maritime capabilities created a combined military system that enabled Venice to project power throughout northeastern Italy, while maintaining its dominant position in Mediterranean commerce. The cultural and artistic flowering that characterized late medieval Italy provided the intellectual and creative foundation for the Renaissance achievements that would distinguish Italian civilization throughout the early modern period. The patronage systems developed by seigneurial courts, papal administration, and wealthy merchant families created unprecedented opportunities for artistic and literary expression, while fostering intellectual environments that encouraged innovation and experimentation. The emergence of vernacular literature as a sophisticated medium for serious artistic expression reflected both the growing cultural confidence of Italian urban populations and the practical requirements of governing diverse territories whose inhabitants possessed different linguistic traditions. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy represented the culmination of medieval Italian literary achievement while establishing precedents for vernacular expression that would influence European literature for centuries. The poem's sophisticated theological framework, combined with its detailed engagement with contemporary political issues, demonstrated the potential for vernacular literature to address the most serious intellectual and spiritual questions while remaining accessible to educated audiences throughout Italy. Dante's innovative use of Italian rather than Latin for serious literary expression reflected his conviction that vernacular languages possessed the flexibility and precision necessary for complex artistic achievement, while his detailed descriptions of contemporary political figures and events provided unprecedented insight into the factional conflicts and personal rivalries that characterized Italian political life during the early 14th century. Petrarch's development of humanist intellectual methods represented a fundamental transformation in European scholarly traditions that would provide the theoretical framework for Renaissance cultural achievements. His systematic study of classical texts, combined with his innovative approaches to textual criticism and historical analysis, established new standards for scholarly accuracy while demonstrating the relevance of ancient wisdom for contemporary problems. Petrarch's extensive correspondence with political leaders, scholars, and artists throughout Europe created intellectual networks that facilitated the exchange of ideas while establishing his reputation as one of the most influential thinkers of his generation. His sonnets and other vernacular poetry demonstrated the potential for Italian literary expression to achieve artistic sophistication that rivaled classical models while addressing contemporary themes and emotions with unprecedented psychological depth. Giotto's revolutionary innovations in painting technique and artistic expression transformed European visual culture, while establishing precedents for realistic representation that would characterize Renaissance artistic achievement. His frescoes in the Arena Chapel at Padua demonstrated new approaches to spatial representation, human emotion, and narrative structure that departed dramatically from the stylized conventions of medieval art while maintaining spiritual significance and theological sophistication. The psychological realism that characterized Giotto's depictions of biblical and contemporary figures reflected his sophisticated understanding of human nature, while his innovative use of perspective and architectural settings created visual environments that enhanced the emotional impact of his religious narratives. The architectural achievements of late medieval Italy reflected both the enormous wealth that commercial prosperity had generated and the sophisticated technical capabilities that Italian craftsmen had developed through centuries of urban construction projects. The completion of major cathedral projects in cities like Florence, Siena, and Milan demonstrated the ability of Italian communities to undertake massive construction enterprises that required coordination between multiple generations of architects, engineers, and craftsmen while incorporating artistic and technical innovations that influenced building practices throughout Europe. The development of new construction techniques, including improved methods for supporting large spans and innovative approaches to decorative stonework, created architectural capabilities that would enable the monumental building projects of the Renaissance period. The economic foundations that supported these cultural achievements reflected the fundamental transformation of Italian commercial and financial systems that had occurred during the 13th and 14th centuries. The development of sophisticated banking networks, international trading relationships, and industrial production capabilities created wealth concentrations that enabled unprecedented levels of artistic patronage while providing the financial resources necessary for major construction projects and scholarly enterprises. The emergence of professional banking houses like the Medici in Florence and the Fugger's Italian operations created financial institutions that could support large-scale artistic and intellectual projects while facilitating the international exchange of ideas and artistic techniques that characterized late medieval European culture. The political fragmentation that marked the conclusion of this period had created the competitive environment that would foster the Renaissance achievements of the 15th century, while establishing the regional power structures that would dominate Italian politics throughout the early modern period. The seigneurial families that had emerged from the collapse of communal governance had demonstrated the effectiveness of autocratic rule in providing stability and prosperity, while their cultural patronage had created artistic and intellectual achievements that enhanced Italy's reputation throughout Europe. The papacy's struggles with temporal governance had revealed the limitations of ecclesiastical authority in secular affairs, while the Great Western Schism had undermined papal prestige and created opportunities for secular authorities to assert greater independence from ecclesiastical oversight. Venice's successful adaptation to territorial governance had created a republican alternative to seigneurial rule that would influence political thought throughout the Renaissance period, while demonstrating the possibility of combining commercial prosperity with territorial expansion. The cultural innovations of this period had established Italian leadership in European intellectual and artistic development, while creating the educational institutions and scholarly traditions that would support continued Italian cultural dominance throughout the Renaissance. The economic systems that had evolved to support these political and cultural developments had created the financial capabilities and commercial networks that would enable Italian cities to maintain their prosperity and influence, despite the political challenges that would characterize the following centuries. As the 14th century drew to a close, Italy had been transformed from a collection of competing communes and imperial territories into a complex mosaic of seigneurial states, territorial republics, and ecclesiastical principalities whose interactions would shape European political development throughout the early modern period. The innovative governmental institutions, cultural achievements, and economic systems that had emerged from this transformation had established Italy as Europe's most sophisticated and influential region, while creating the foundation for the Renaissance flowering that would mark the peninsula's greatest period of cultural achievement and international influence.